Chapter 890. The amount of wine in the crystal glass wasn't much, but if a girl drank 8 glasses at once, it was still a lot. The waiter opened his mouth to say something, but after taking a look at Bart, he shut his mouth obediently. This wasn't a place for him to interrupt. Chris glanced at the wine glass. The smile on her face had already disappeared. She shook her head slightly and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Bart. Please forgive me for not being able to drink these 8 glasses of wine. I made an appointment with you today to discuss the matter of your deposit. The high interest rate of Buffett banks can bring you rich returns. This is a mutually beneficial business." Scumbag indeed. Chris's heart was filled with disgust. Even someone as experienced as her knew how to protect herself. If it was a little girl with no experience, she would probably have drunk 8 cups of wine due to the other party's identity. If her alcohol tolerance was slightly lower, she would be at the mercy of Bart's mercy. Not drinking? Bart's eyes flashed viciously. He slammed the glass on the table and looked at Chris unkindly. "It's not your first day at work. You don't know who I am, do you? How dare you talk to me like this? Aren't you afraid that I'll tell your boss and make you lose your job forever?" The commotion attracted the attention of some people in the surroundings. Everyone looked at Bart and Chris with some surprise. They didn't know how this beautiful girl had provoked the mad dog Bart. Bart moved closer to Christy and said in a low voice, "No one can avoid my carriage when doing business in Chaos City, unless they just want to take a look around Chaos City. My word is more effective than the city lords. You have to drink today, or I'll make sure you can't get a single order in Chaos City." Chris clenched her fists under her skirt. She looked at the domineering Bart and pursed her lips. In the eyes of these guys, they were just playthings that could be toyed with as they pleased because these guys held their lives in their hands. Although she was already the manager of a branch of Buffett banks, in the eyes of these guys, there was no difference. Looking at the wine glass, a trace of hesitation and struggle appeared on Chris's face. She hated this kind of deal, but she had spent 5 years to climb to this position. She was unwilling to be wiped out like this. The waiter holding the glass looked at Chris pitifully. He had seen this kind of thing many times, but most of those beautiful women threw themselves at the men. The smile on Bart's face was also somewhat proud. What kind of woman hadn't he seen before? As long as it was something he wanted, he always had a way to make them submit. The more unyielding a woman was, the more interesting and refreshing the process would be. Just like this woman now, she was already starting to make him a little excited. "Miss Chris, I didn't expect to see you here again." At this moment, a surprised voice sounded from the side, and a figure slowly walked over. Chris, who was hesitating to reach for the glass, was slightly taken aback. She turned her head and saw the person walking over slowly. It was Abraham, whom she had met at Amy's tonight. Her face lit up. He was about to succeed, but he was interrupted. Bart looked at Abraham with some displeasure. Abraham's clothes and appearance were quite ordinary, and he didn't have any impression of him. He didn't seem like a famous mission. Bart suddenly stood up with a gloomy face. He looked at Abraham and said in a deep voice, "Who are you? Can't you see I'm talking to her?" "Who am I?" Abraham stopped, slightly taken aback. Bart saw that he was scared stiff, and was even more certain that he was just a guy who had forced his way into the banquet. His face grew colder, and he was about to say something. Bowen, the head of the Marquis family, who had been surrounded by the crowd, hurried over with a group of people. He walked past Bart and stopped in front of Abraham. He looked at Abraham respectfully and guiltily, and said, "Duke Abraham, why are you here so early? I should have received you at the door." Everyone in the banquet hall turned their attention to Duke Abraham upon hearing this, and they all gathered around him to extend respectful salutes. Many of them had come here specifically to greet Duke Abraham. Duke Abraham. Bart's face changed in an instant. Looking at Abraham, who had an ordinary appearance and didn't have any outstanding clothes, his heart was in a mess. His main purpose for coming today was to get close to Duke Abraham and expand his transportation channels in the Roth Empire. He had thought that Bowen would definitely welcome such an important guest with great fanfare, so he didn't think about it at all. He didn't expect that he would bump into him and act so arrogantly. Bart felt uneasy. He could only hope that Abraham didn't take it to heart. Fortunately, his tone was not very friendly, and he didn't say anything inappropriate. I had an early dinner tonight, and then had a pleasant business talk with Miss Christie. I came here earlier than expected. Abraham nodded with a smile. Everyone's gazes landed on Christie. They were curious about what kind of business this beautiful young lady had discussed with Duke Abraham. If the Duke used the word pleasant, this young lady was destined to be extraordinary. Some people recognized Christie and were surprised that this competent manager of Buffett Banks was able to take down Abraham, who had just arrived at Chaos City not long ago. Of course, more people began to think about how to make use of this young lady to get closer to the Duke. Could it be? Bart thought of what Christie had said. Could it be that she was late because she had a business talk with Duke Abraham, and he had made things difficult for her just now? With that thought, Bart's face darkened even more. I see. Then this Miss Christie is really something. She even got the Duke's first business deal in Chaos City, Bowen said with a smile as he looked at Christie. Bowen looked at Chris and said with a smile. Everyone laughed in agreement and looked at Chris with eyes full of admiration. Christie smiled modestly and then found a chance to bow to Abraham. She respectfully said, Duke Abraham, I didn't expect you to attend this banquet. Chapter 891. Bart's expression changed slightly, but he quickly regained his composure and said with a bashful smile, Your Excellency Duke, Miss Chris and I are also discussing business. It's just that we had a small disagreement before. I didn't expect that Your Excellency Duke had already cooperated with Miss Chris. Seeing Miss Chris's ability and credibility, I naturally have no problems. I've decided to cooperate with Miss Chris and deposit 50 million copper coins into Buffett Banks. Chris glanced at Bart, her eyes full of disgust. Bart was really disgusting. The 50 million coppers wasn't because he recognized her ability, but because he wanted to please Duke Abraham. But as a branch manager, she couldn't refuse such a big customer, and she couldn't bear the consequences of refusing Celt Carriage Company's cooperation. Bart glanced at Chris from the corner of his eyes, the corner of his mouth slightly raised. He was well aware of the rules of this circle, so he was able to have everyone under his control. From a coachman to controlling half of the logistics of Chaos City, he knew better than anyone else how to deal with people below him. No one could refuse the olive branch extended by Celt Carriage and Horse Company, because everyone knew whose era it was. Abraham stared at Bart. He did not like to deal with businessmen, because they often wore many layers of masks compared to ordinary people. It was difficult to see their faces under the masks. It was also difficult to find a like-minded person among them. Busy people like them did not have the time to look for delicious food. They were not as interesting as the little girl named Carlos. If it weren't for Bowen's kind invitation, he wouldn't have come to this banquet since they could be considered relatives. However, how could he not see that the situation wasn't as Bart had described? It was just that Chris didn't say anything, which meant that she had tacitly agreed with Bart's words. The 50 million deposit should be very important to her. Otherwise, she wouldn't have specially come to this banquet. Therefore, he didn't intend to say anything more. We, the Buffett Banks, refused to accept these 50 million copper coins. Furthermore, from today onwards, the Buffett Banks will terminate all cooperation with the Celt Carriage Company. At this moment, a voice rang out from behind the crowd. Everyone turned around in surprise, and their eyes lit up when they saw a figure in a bright red ceremonial robe slowly walking towards them from the hill. Many people found this gown to be rather familiar. It was most likely the same gown as the one that Gloria had worn during the Chamber of Commerce's mid-year banquet. However, the bright red color gave off a completely different vibe on Sheer. There was a hint of seduction in her cold demeanor, and she was like an enchanting queen that no one could look away from. Of course, the most surprising thing was that Mr. Hill, the head of the Buffett family, had directly rejected Bart. It had to be pointed out that Celt Carriage Company was one of the upstarts in Chaos City. They controlled half of the logistics industry in Chaos City and had a lot of say in it. Miss Hill. Chris's eyes suddenly lit up. She turned around and looked at the queen-like figure slowly walking towards her on the hill. She couldn't help but feel excited. If there was anyone in Buffett Banks who had the right to reject Bart, Buffett, it could only be Miss Hill, except for Mr. Buffett, who no longer managed the company's affairs. However, like everyone else, Chris also didn't expect Miss Hill to reject Bart. She even directly cut off all business with Celt Carriage and Horse Company. This was a cooperation that every branch manager had racked their brains to achieve. Miss Hill, what did you just say? Bart frowned, slightly taken aback by Miss Hill's words. Miss Hill stood in front of Bart. She looked at him calmly and said, Mr. Bart, I said that from today onwards, Buffett Banks will stop all business with Celt Carriage and you. Do you understand now? Bart's face suddenly darkened. He looked at Miss Hill and said in a low voice, Do you know how big Celt Carriage and Horse Company is now? When I complete the acquisition of Bray Horse Company, more than 50% of Chaos City's logistics will be in my hands. Are you sure Buffett Banks wants to cut off all business with Celt Carriage and Horse Company? The banquet hall gradually quieted down. Everyone looked at Miss Hill and Bart. One was the head of the biggest conglomerate on the Norland continent, while the other was a rising magnate who was gradually climbing to the top of Chaos City's business circle. It wasn't common for them to be at loggerheads. Miss Hill smiled contemptuously and said, Buffett Banks controls 70% of the long-distance currency circulation on the Norland continent. The annual cash flow through them is 10,000 times the total assets of Celt Carriage and Horse Company. The safety and efficiency of their own carriage and horse company are far better than Celt Carriage and Horse Company. So, how big do you think Celt Carriage and Horse Company is? Bart looked at Miss Hill. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The veins on his forehead were faintly throbbing. 10,000 times was enough to make any words pale in comparison. Even if he ran fast enough, in front of a colossus like the Buffett Bank, he was still just an ant that could run faster. Everyone in the banquet hall had different expressions. Although everyone knew Buffett Banks was huge, few knew exactly how big it was. However, when Miss Hill said 10,000 times, everyone clearly realized how terrifying it was. Buffett Banks wasn't just a bank in Chaos City, but a bank in the entire Norland continent. Celt Carriage and Horse Company was doing well, but it was far from being comparable to Buffett Banks. An 18-year-old girl who was born with a silver spoon in her mouth and had never suffered a bit dared to talk to him like that. Bart's heart was burning with anger. He looked at Miss Hill and said, Buffett Banks has the right to be proud, but if you shut out your business partners without any reason and speak ill of them, I'd like to know how long you can continue to be so glorious. Buffett Banks has always been known for its excellent service. We welcome money with a smile on our face. Miss Hill's expression gradually turned cold. She looked at Bart and said coldly, Why are you only picking on you? Are you pretending to be ignorant? Do you need me to expose the dirty things you've done? Bart's expression changed. In the end, he clenched his fists and swallowed his anger. Chapter 892. In the past, the most troublesome thing for merchants was the huge amount of money they had to carry with them. They would often encounter fierce bandits and lose both their money and their lives. Later, Buffett Banks appeared, and its branches spread all over the Norland continent. It created an original deposit receipt and withdrawal system, which turned conspicuous money into a deposit receipt. If it was an experienced customer, they didn't even need a deposit receipt. Their deposit information was quickly updated, and they could withdraw the money directly from other places with the saved information. This completely solved the problem of security for the merchants. Although they had to pay a certain handling fee, this fee was not on the same level as the high cost of hiring powerful sorcerers and knights to escort them. Besides, there was almost no risk, so it was very popular among the merchants. Therefore, in just a few decades, a financial empire that covered the entire Norland continent and even had branches on Dragon Island emerged. Because there was no money to rob, and it was difficult to find a way to sell goods, the bandits on the major trade routes gradually disappeared. It was as if Buffett Banks had wiped out an industry. It had to be admitted that Buffett Banks had penetrated into every corner of the Norland continent. After launching the Personal Savings and Loans program, it was closely related to the ordinary people. It would be an immeasurable loss for any company if they were rejected by such a giant. Therefore, the warning from Mr. Hill was very important. At least, no one present dared to ignore it. Buffett's example was still in front of them. Even a giant like Celt Carriage Company was rejected. No one would want to try. The girls from Buffett Banks were all very good-looking. However, from today onwards, no big boss would dare to have any ideas about them. Christy looked at Mr. Hill with red eyes. She couldn't control her emotions. A huge deposit of $50 million and a partnership with a giant in the logistics industry was rejected by Mr. Hill just to tell the world one thing. Don't touch the girls from Buffett Banks. Abraham appraised the Hill with a hint of approval in his eyes. This rising star of the business world had left a deep impression on him. He had met her a few times during the royal banquet in Rendezvous. The last time he had seen her, she was only a 14-year-old little girl. For the 5 years had passed since then, and she had already become the leader of the Buffett family. Looking at Bart again, Abraham frowned. He had always despised this kind of person. Moreover, Chris could be considered an acquaintance of his. It made him feel even more uncomfortable that something like this happened to her. Bart saw the change in Abraham's expression, and his gloomy mood sunk to the bottom. It seems that today's wish will not come true. He looked at Chris again, and his eyes were full of hatred. Today, because of this woman, he went for wool and came home shorn. He would only be a joke if he stayed here. He immediately cupped his hands to Abraham and said, "Lord Duke, I suddenly feel a little unwell. I need to go back and see a doctor. I will take my leave first." Abraham nodded slightly. This was Chaos City, after all, so he couldn't really say anything. Besides, it would be very difficult for him to say anything better than what the Hill had said. Bart turned and left. His pace was a little quick, like a panicked dog. The Hill didn't look at Bart again. She turned to Abraham with a smile and said, "Duke Abraham, long time no see. I heard that you have been eating at Mamie's recently. It seems that you are very satisfied with Mr. Mack's cooking." "Miss Hill, you also like to eat at Mamie's?" "Mr. Mack's cooking is without a doubt. I came to Chaos City especially for him. Otherwise, I wouldn't even be able to take a step out of Rendezvous in the past few decades." Abraham looked at the Hill with surprise. The Hill nodded with a smile and said, "Everyone in Chaos City knows about Mr. Mack's cooking. It's just that if you want to eat at Mamie's now, you have to line up a lot earlier than usual. I can only go there when I'm free. Mr. Mack won't save a seat for me." Abraham's interest was piqued by the Hill, and he began to chat with the Hill. "Even I have to line up at the entrance every day, let alone you. However, Mr. Mack is a diligent cook, so it's quite interesting to line up outside. It's worth it. After all, I'm also a free man." The wealthy businessmen of Chaos City stood awkwardly off to the side. They were all amazed by the way the Hill cut into the conversation. At the same time, they also committed the name Mamie's to memory. Duke Abraham had always been a mysterious man, but he had come all the way from Rendezvous to Chaos City for a restaurant. Furthermore, it seemed that he didn't like to listen to romance. If they didn't learn more about Mamie's, they wouldn't even be able to bring up the topic. Mamie's is such a wonderful place. It's also my lucky day. A smile appeared on Christie's face as she looked at Shear and Abraham chatting happily. If it weren't for the fact that she had met Duke Abraham at Mamie restaurant, she wouldn't have known how the night would have ended. Then, she couldn't help but think of the man who had placed his big hand on the little girl's head. That gentle smile and words, she silently thought in her heart, that boss. What kind of ability does he have to make so many people fall in love with his delicacies? The next time I go, I must properly try that stinky tofu. You're Christy, right? Christy was lost in thought when the Hill appeared in front of her. Yes. Christy faltered for a moment, then hurriedly bowed to the Hill. She looked at the Hill with respect and gratitude and said, "Yes, Miss Hill, I am Christy." A smile appeared on the Hill's face. She extended her hand to Christy and said, "Congratulations. You've done what countless predecessors of Buffett Banks have failed to do for decades. You've received your first deposit from Duke Abraham." Christy hurriedly reached out and shook the Hill's hand. Her face blushed slightly, and she said, "It was just a coincidence. If it weren't for Mamie's, I don't think I would have been so lucky." Luck is also a part of strength. Duke Abraham just told me how you did it. You relied on your strength, not just luck. Of course, Mamie's is indeed a good place. The Hill nodded with a smile. Then, she looked at Christy and said, "If I remember correctly, you've only been promoted to manager of the third branch for less than 3 months, right?" Yes. Christy nodded. Then stay for a full year. It's a very good position. You can learn a lot. I stayed in this position for 10 years. The Hill nodded and said, by the way, what do you think of the rule? If a salesperson in a branch is violated due to business relations, the branch's management will all be dismissed. Christy froze for a moment, and then a surprised smile appeared on her face. She hurriedly nodded and said, I think it should be very good. Chapter 893. At the end of the banquet, the guests left one after another. Hill got into the carriage. A pale, golden, luminous pearl shone softly in the carriage. She looked at the middle-aged man sitting opposite her and said, raise the price of Black Horse by 30%. The man looked at Hill and said, Miss, the negotiations between Black Horse and Celt are almost over. I'm afraid they won't be able to accept such a sudden increase. As long as the contract hasn't been signed, any changes are normal business behavior. If they can't accept it, that's their business. The corners of Hill's mouth rose slightly. Besides, they will accept the offer. The man hesitated. But, Miss, Black Horse has brought rich returns to the bank over the years. It's a high-quality asset. If you suddenly sell it, there will be some doubts from the consortium. Are you sure you don't want to reconsider? Those old guys don't even have the right to vote. If they want to question it, let them. Do you want me to explain it to them? Hill smiled and lifted a corner of the carriage curtain to look at the passing street outside. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly as he said, it looks like a promising future, but who knows that it will soon become a sunset industry. If we don't get rid of it now, we won't be able to get rid of it later. The man opened his mouth, but swallowed his questions when he looked at Hill's profile. He nodded and said, yes. Then he opened the folder and wrote 2 lines. As Hill had said, Hill had 100% of the voting rights of the Buffett Consortium. She didn't need to explain any of her decisions to anyone, and no one could interfere, including old Buffett. No one could understand why Ian would hand over such a massive amount of power to Hill without any restrictions. However, Buffett continued to grow at a rapid pace during the 3 years that Hill had been in charge of it, and all of the voices of doubt had disappeared. No one could surpass him in terms of foresight, strong execution ability, and accurate grasp of the wind. I won't accept 50 million, but I'll take 50 million more from you. Then I'll dig a hole and bury you more thoroughly. The corner of Hill's mouth curled up into a sneer. He reached out and took a financial report from the bookshelf at the side. The carriage was moving so fast that it didn't shake at all. Damn bitch. I'm going to deal with all of you sooner or later. Let's see if you still dare to talk to me like this when I have complete control over Chaos City's logistics system. In a magnificent room, Bart flipped over a cabinet that was filled with all kinds of exquisite collectibles. Porcelain and jade objects fell to the ground and shattered into pieces. The servant stood trembling in the corner, not daring to speak. Bart smashed a few more things before his anger subsided a little. Old master, bad news. At this time, a figure dressed like an accountant hurried in. Seeing the things on the ground, his expression changed slightly, but he still walked forward quickly. What's wrong? Bart frowned. He had a bad premonition and raised his hand to signal the servants to leave. The accountant said anxiously, just now, the Black Horse team suddenly raised their offer by 30%, and their tone was very tough. They only gave us 1 day to consider, and they want all the transactions in cash. There is no room for negotiation. What? Bart's expression also changed. His thick eyebrows stood up, and he said angrily, didn't we have an agreement before? Why did they suddenly change their mind? The man shook his head with a sullen expression. I don't know. The acquisition team is in a complete mess now. I don't know what to do. Old master, do you think we should continue with the acquisition? Bart was silent for a while with a gloomy expression. Finally, he gritted his teeth and said, sign. The man hesitated. But, master, we're a little tight on cash right now. During this time, we've been constantly expanding and purchasing. 150 million copper coins are already a little difficult. If we add another 50 million, I'm afraid we can only borrow from Buffett banks. The veins on Bart's forehead throbbed. He was also clear about the cash flow problem. Kelt's expansion speed was too fast. Although it looked fierce, the cash flow in their hands was actually very tight. He had met Christie this time to take advantage of her, and in fact had the intention of formally contacting Buffett Banks. But he hadn't expected that the Hill would directly cut off all opportunities for cooperation. I'll take care of the money problem. Bly has to be bought. This is the most important part of Kelt's expansion. After buying Bart, Kelt will have no opponents in Chaos City. Tell them to finalize the contract as soon as possible. I will bring the remaining $50 million before tomorrow night, Bart said in a low voice. Yes, I will go right away. The man hurried off again. Bastard. Bart kicked over the big vase next to him and strode out of the door. Amy, can you go play with Jessica tomorrow? Father has to go out to gather materials for a day. Because the journey is a little long and dangerous, I can't bring Amy along, Meg said with a smile as he stood beside the bed and looked at Amy, who was lying on the little bed. Amy shook her head and sat up. She looked at Meg with a serious expression and said, Father, if there is any danger, you must bring Amy along. Little me just learned a super powerful spell from Master Urian. As long as you take me with you, I'll be able to protect Father. Also, I only have one day off a week. I want to be with Father, Amy said coquettishly as she pouted her little mouth and blinked her big blue eyes at Meg. Meg felt as if his heart was about to melt. He didn't know what to say when he saw Amy's pitiful look. Meg thought for a while and decided to change his plan. He stroked Amy's head with a smile and said, All right, I will bring you along. When we come back, Father will make roast duck for you. Amy turned to look at Ugly Duckling, who was sleeping soundly while hugging her leg, and said hesitantly, Father, Ugly Duckling is still young. Why don't we do it later? All right, let's find other ducks. Meg looked at Ugly Duckling pitifully and nodded with a smile. The late autumn night was cold and lonely. Chapter 894. The news of the mercenary groups being wiped out had spread throughout the Chaos Guild. In just a few days, the same thing had happened more than a dozen times, and none of them had survived. Furthermore, not only were they weak mercenary groups, but a group with a 7th-tier magic caster had also been wiped out. The guild hadn't released the results of the investigation yet, but this morning they released an announcement. All mercenaries, please be careful. Mercenary groups with elves in their group are advised to suspend their missions until the Grey Temple and the City Lord's Castle find out the details. This announcement undoubtedly caused quite a stir. It confirmed the rumors that had been spread before. Although they didn't know who the culprits were, one thing was for sure. They were targeting the elves and the mercenary groups. The City Lord's Castle's announcement about accepting wandering elves and Alex's warning added a layer of haze to the mercenary groups with elves in their group. Some even panicked. Elves were excellent archers and natural-born healers. If a mercenary group had an elven healer, the casualty rate would be greatly reduced. Therefore, most mercenary groups would try their best to recruit an elven member. Healing was an important part of the mercenary group. Now that something like this had happened, some mercenary groups chose to suspend their missions for safety reasons and wait for the City Lord's Castle and the Grey Temple's investigation. More mercenary groups chose to let their elves stay in the city for the time being. The mercenary groups began to reduce the difficulty of their missions and continued to work. Of course, some mercenary groups were still holding on to the idea of getting lucky. It was said that the City Lord's Castle and the Grey Temple had sent out many people to search for the elves. Perhaps the elves had already escaped. Outside the guild hall, Chiwa looked at everyone and said, If you're still worried, let's rest for a few more days. We'll see how things go before we go on a mission. Although the weather had turned cold, she was still wearing short leather pants that exposed her thighs and a folded boomerang on her back. She looked very serious. As a small mercenary group, the Rose Mercenary Squad had no way to deal with unexpected situations. More importantly, one of their main damage dealers, Evan, was an elf. Leader, we haven't been on a mission for 3 days. If we continue to stop, our family will be stretched thin, the Minotaur Demon Dentist said helplessly as he scratched his head. Powerful mercenary groups could hunt high-level monsters and earn high commissions. However, a small mercenary group like the Rose Mercenary Group whose strongest member was only a level 4 magician, could not earn a generous reward every time they went out on a mission. After deducting the various funds and expenses, there was not much money that could be distributed to each member. The other members had similar expressions. Being a mercenary was a profession that licked blood from the edge of a blade. Even if this kind of thing didn't happen, there would still be many people dying in the hands of magical beasts every day. I also agree to go on a mission. With so many mercenary groups going on missions, as long as we don't go to remote places, we shouldn't encounter those guys. Evan, who was holding his wand, nodded in agreement. He said confidently, "Also, if those guys really do have designs on us, they might just be giving us free money. Didn't the guild announcement say that those who can provide accurate information will be rewarded with 1 million copper coins?" Yes, magician Evan is very powerful. With him around, we don't have to worry at all. Eva looked at Evan with admiration. According to the current statistics, 21 mercenary groups have been annihilated, including a group with a 7th level magician. Our Rose mercenary group is no match for them. Chiwil shook his head unmoved. He glanced at everyone, and after a moment of silence, he said, "Then let's vote. Those who agree to go on a mission, raise your hand." Other than Scott and Chiwil, everyone raised their hand. Chiwil nodded. "All right, since most of you want to go on a mission, we'll do it today. However, we'll try to choose the easiest missions. Also, we'll have to go to places with more people. It'll be safer that way." As Chiwil and the others were talking, 2 figures, one big and one small, came out of the guild hall and walked past them. "Huh? Isn't that Mr. Mac?" Minotaur Demon Dennis said, a little surprised. "It really is." Scott's eyes also lit up. He smiled and greeted them. "Mr. Mac, little boss." Meg heard the voice and turned around. Seeing Chiwil and the others standing at the entrance of the guild hall, a hint of surprise appeared on his face. However, they had fought side by side before, so they could be considered old acquaintances. He smiled and nodded. "Oh, it's you guys from the Rose mercenary group. What's up? Are you going on a mission today?" Miss Leatherpants, Uncle Minotaur, Uncle Roast Rabbit, and Amy glanced at Evan and Eva, then chose to ignore them. She smiled widely and said, "Hello." Evan and Eva's expressions didn't look too good, but it was all thanks to this pair of father and daughter that they were able to survive last time, so they couldn't say anything. Although they felt a little helpless about their strange nicknames, looking at little Amy's smiling face, their faces were also full of smiles. Chiwil smiled at Amy, then looked at Meg and said, "Yes, but Mr. Meg, are you going out of the city today? It's not safe outside the city during this period, so I don't recommend you go out at this time. You probably haven't seen the notice over there, right?" Although Meg and Amy had shown their abilities last time, Meg was after all a chef, not a professional mercenary. It was too easy for him to be in danger with little Amy, who was only 4 years old. "Oh, I saw that. But this time, we're just going to a closer place to find some ingredients. It shouldn't be a problem," Meg said with a smile. He glanced at Evan, who was still arrogant, and then looked at Chiwil. "Miss Chiwil, where are you going this time? If it's convenient, maybe you can give us a ride and save us the trouble of renting a horse." "Sure. Boss Mag's culinary skills are so superb. We're in for a treat. If it weren't for the fact that the prices at your restaurant are so high, I would definitely go there often." Dennis was quite excited. Chapter 895. Evan took a glance at Meg and said, "Team leader, I think it's best we don't add any new members in this unstable situation. If we don't work well with them, they could drag us down." "That's right. I've heard that those guys target mercenary groups with elves. If we have an elf, the possibility of our mercenary group becoming their target will increase by a lot. This is simply too dangerous for us." Eva nodded in agreement. A contemplative look appeared on Chiwil's face. Evan and Eva's words were quite reasonable. All of the major mercenary groups were in a precarious situation right now, as very few powerful beings above the 7th tier would accept mercenary missions from the Union. As such, the 7th tier Magicaster that was slain the day before yesterday was already a top-tier powerhouse that most mercenary groups couldn't match up to. Mercenaries needed to work well together in battle, and a well-coordinated mercenary group could fight enemies above their level. Amy's magic power was indeed quite powerful. She was already a 4th-tier magic caster. Mag looked like an ordinary person, but she didn't believe that he had been able to slay an ironhide bull with a single cleaver because he had practiced his knife skills in the kitchen. However, they were still outsiders to the Rose mercenary squad, and they hadn't even seen each other much, let alone work well together. Chiwil looked at Meg with a perplexed expression and said, "Mr. Meg, the situation might be more serious than you think. You're a restaurant owner, not a mercenary, so there's no need for you to leave the city at this time. Also, you're taking little Amy with you, so this kind of danger is completely avoidable." Meg looked at Chiwil and could sense her concern, but he still shook his head with a smile and said, "I understand, but I've always had good luck, so there shouldn't be any problems. If it's not convenient for you, Miss Chiwil, we'll rent a wildebeest ourselves. If you have the opportunity, you can come to Amy's for a visit." Meg then nodded at Dennis and Scott before leaving with Amy's little hand in his. His request was indeed a bit excessive. Those guys were aiming for the mercenary group. If a weak mercenary group had 2 elves, even if one of them was a half-elf, they would still be the first choice of those guys. However, Meg only mentioned it for the sake of their old friendship. Since they were unwilling, he naturally wouldn't force them. "Captain, Mr. Mack is a loyal man. Last time, we were almost wiped out, but he's saved us. If the father and daughter go to the wilderness alone, I'm afraid." Scott looked at Meg and the others' backs. He wanted to say something, but stopped. He looked a little anxious. "Does saving us once mean that we have to die for him? I don't want to be targeted and wiped out just because there's an extra half-elf in the team." Evan pursed his lips. Chiwil frowned as he watched the father and daughter walk away. After a moment of silence, he seemed to have made up his mind. He took 2 steps forward and said loudly, "Mr. Meg, come with us." Mag stopped in his tracks and turned to look at Sivir with a hint of surprise on his face. Half an hour later, a horse-drawn carriage full of people was driven out of Chaos City toward the wilderness, surrounded by 4 horses. There were 8 people in the Rose mercenary group. The captain, Chiwil, was a 3rd-tier hunter who was good at archery and boomerangs. Scott was a 3rd-tier swordsman. The Minotaur demon, Dennis, was a tank with a giant shield. He had good defense because of his earth element, and he could quickly build an earth wall for the group. Evan, the elven magic caster, was a 4th-tier magic caster. Although he had just broken through, he had become the main damage dealer of the group. He was also the target of protection. Eva was a 1st-tier healing magic caster. She was very weak. The monkey who drove the carriage, Sydney, was in charge of scouting. Scott was also a 3rd-tier swordsman. Sam was in charge of setting up traps. Meg was familiar with the group. Except for a few more scars on their bodies, he could still see them. Meg felt good. In the mercenary profession, people died every day. The place they were going to today was near the Giant's Canyon. It was a rather strange place, named after the dozens of giant footprints in the canyon. Even the forest trolls wouldn't be able to leave behind such giant footprints. It had become an unsolved mystery. Low-level magical beasts roamed the valley all year round, and precious herbs grew here. Because they grew on both sides of the steep cliffs and hidden in the cracks of the rocks, they weren't easy to find. Instead, many mercenaries and herb gatherers who weren't strong enough came here. It was one of the most popular places in the wastelands. "Mr. Mack, you said there was a golden scale deer in the basin next to the giant valley. Is that true?" Dennis, who was sitting opposite Meg, asked Meg in a low voice. Everyone looked at Meg. They were going to accept the mission, but after Meg shared the news with them and agreed to go with them to catch the golden scale deer, they followed Meg to the giant valley. The golden scale deer was an extremely rare 3rd-tier magical beast. It was named for its golden scale-like fur. Both its antlers and its skin were extremely valuable. If they could hunt a golden scale deer, they could sell it for at least 200,000 coppers. This was a very high return for the Rose mercenary group. This is the information I bought from the guild. The scouts found traces of a golden scale deer and saw it from afar some time ago. I don't know if we'll be lucky enough to see it today. Mag pulled out a piece of parchment that was tied up with a string from his little bag and handed it to Dennis. Although Meg did not know the time limit of the information, he had to make it look like a treasure map. It was as if it would be a waste of 100 gold coins if he did not make it look like a treasure map. Everyone's eyes lit up as they looked at the information in Mag's hands. The parchment meant that this piece of information was at least 7th tier. The starting price was above 10,000, and no more than 10 copies of each piece of information could be made. Dennis hesitated for a moment. Seeing Meg's open expression, he reached out and took the parchment. After a while, he handed it back to Meg and nodded. Mr. Mack is right. This information was just obtained 3 days ago. The golden scale deer did appear there, but there was no news of anyone catching it. Chapter 896. Chiwell looked at Meg and said seriously, Mr. Meg is willing to share such precious information with us. Even if we do catch the golden scale deer, it will be up to Mr. Meg to decide how to distribute it. She thought Meg had only heard about it from a mercenary. She did not expect it to be information from the guild. Mag smiled. I've heard that the golden scale deer is not very aggressive, but it is very fast and has a kind of illusion that can confuse people who come close to it. If it were just the two of us, it would be very difficult to catch it. If we catch the golden scale deer, I want the antlers and half the price of the skin. Evan said, You are just providing information. How dare you ask for so much? The antlers are worth at least 50,000 coppers. Aren't you a bit too greedy? Are you sure we don't need to do anything this time? Meg looked at Evan with a smile. Evan felt uncomfortable under Meg's gaze. Thinking of what happened last time, he felt his face heat up. He snorted coldly, turned his face away, and slowly clenched his fists. The Rose mercenary group looked a little embarrassed. Evan was normal, except for his arrogance. But every time he met Meg, he would become a little strange. Chiwell said, The Rose mercenary group has no objection to Mr. Meg's distribution. I hope we can cooperate well this time. Meg smiled and nodded. He had been out for a day, so it was natural to take something back. Otherwise, it would not be in line with his character and temperament. Except for Evan and Eva, who rolled her eyes the whole time, Meg and the rest of the Rose mercenary group got along well. 2 hours later, a huge canyon appeared in the distance. The mountain looked like it had been split from the middle by a giant axe. The top half was hidden in the clouds, and it looked very spectacular. That was the giant canyon. From time to time, mercenary groups would pass by, and they couldn't help but take a few more glances at Amy. He had never seen such a young girl in the wastelands. What kind of father would be so ignorant as to bring such a beautiful girl into the wastelands? If she was hurt by a magical beast, it would be a sin. Amy leaned on Meg's shoulder and looked around curiously. Although this was not her first time out of the city, she was still very curious about everything. Fortunately, the people around her were all veteran mercenaries who had been in the wilderness for many years. Otherwise, Meg would not have been able to handle the barrage of questions. The carriage continued to move forward from the side of the giant canyon. There was a nameless basin 5 or 6 kilometers away. Because there were very few magic beasts and precious herbs there, very few mercenary groups would go there. No one wanted to give a name to such a completely uninhabited place. However, that was the destination of Meg's trip. Meg had thought about choosing this place. It was closer to the giant canyon, so it would be easier for the mercenaries to feel safe here and agree to go with him. Even if they didn't meet the Rose mercenary group, Meg's plan was to find a mercenary group with elves and not too strong to form a team. Since he knew that someone was targeting a mercenary group in Chaos City just to catch elves, it would not be like him to not do something. Back then, he had said on the city wall that since someone had come here to provoke him, he would dig a hole and fill it with them. From a hunter's point of view, that place was the most suitable place to reel in the net. If he were the other party, seeing a mercenary group with 2 elves going to that almost uninhabited basin alone was simply like a plate of good food delivered to his door. This was exactly what he wanted to create. Using himself as bait was risky, but it was also the most efficient way. After traveling for another dozen or so minutes, a depression that resembled a sinkhole appeared before their eyes. The horse-drawn carriage arrived at the edge of the depression, and Mag carried Amy to the edge of the depression to look down. The cliff was almost 90 degrees vertical, and it was hundreds of meters deep. There were many dark caves on the stone walls. The basin was about 1 kilometer in diameter, and it was a little dark down there. In the center of the basin was a stone forest. Huge black stones stood tall, but many of them were in disarray. There were also patches of coniferous forest at the edge. The cries of birds and beasts echoed in the basin from time to time, but there was no one in sight. "Wow, what a big basin!" Amy exclaimed in surprise. She opened her arms and was about to jump in. Luckily, Meg caught her in time and looked at Amy helplessly. Although the little one had learned to fly with the Pope's blessing, Meg had asked Amy not to tell anyone about it after they returned to Chaos City. Except for a few people like Crassus and Julian, no one else knew that Amy could fly. The reason was simple. Meg wanted Amy to have a backup plan. A gust of cold and damp wind blew up from the bottom of the basin. Evan shivered and frowned. Is there really a golden scale deer in this godforsaken place? Don't golden scale deer like sunny and dry places? There's nothing wrong with the Union's information. I've been to this basin twice, but I didn't find anything good. Moreover, the sun only shines on the bottom of the valley at noon every day, and it's gone in less than half an hour, Sam said with a smile. Meg thought for a while and smiled. In that case, is it possible that the golden scale deer will appear at the bottom of the valley at that time? Everyone's eyes lit up. If there really was a golden scale deer here, the possibility was not low. Then let's go down first and see if we can find anything else in the basin. Sivert tied her horse to the side and carefully led the way down a small path. Meg looked around, and his eyes paused for a moment on a rocky mountain not far away. The corners of his mouth turned up slightly, and he walked down the basin with Amy in his arms. In the wilderness, in a dense forest, in a house hidden by trees, a demon rushed in and said excitedly, "Boss, I just received news that a small mercenary group has entered the basin next to the giant valley. There are 2 piglets in the group, a male and a small one. The scout said that the small one is the best and can be sold for a good price. It's worth as much as the piglets we caught these days." Chapter 897. The process of searching in the basin was somewhat boring. There were almost no magic beasts, and there were only a few wild beasts. Only pheasants and hares would occasionally pass by. Even so, Sivert and the others were still extremely cautious as they walked. Because in this wilderness, not only were powerful magic beasts fatal, but even a small poisonous bug could take one's life. Especially in a dark and damp place like the basin, snakes, scorpions, and poisonous bugs were the most common. However, their journey was quite smooth. The biggest scare was when a 10-meter-long python pounced out of a nearby cave. As soon as it appeared, it was burned to ashes by a fireball from AI Me, who was eager to give it a try. Chiwell walked in front with a torch in his hand. Coster and Skoll walked on his left and right. Dennis walked at the back with his shield, protecting Meg, Amy, Evan, and Eva in the middle. Monkey climbed the vines on the cliff and swayed from side to side, scouting from high up and occasionally whistling to pass on information. They searched for an hour and almost turned the bottom of the basin upside down. Finally, they found a soft golden scale next to a boulder with a pale, golden metallic luster. This is the scale of a golden scale deer. I saw one when I was young, but unfortunately, it ran away. I only found a few scales that looked exactly like this one. Sam picked up the scale and examined it carefully for a while with a look of certainty. Great, it seems that the information was correct. The golden scale deer is very likely to appear in this area. Dennis rubbed his hands excitedly, and the others could not hide their excitement. Mag took a closer look at this stretch of huge rocks. It was about 100 square meters in size, and there was a hint of gold in the white rocks. They were glowing under the light of the fire, but they shouldn't be valuable. Otherwise, even if it was a 600-meter-high cliff, someone would try their best to move all of them up. His gaze landed on the platform. Mag looked at the center of the slanted giant rock. There was a clear spring in the center of the giant rock like a pearl. "Is Lulu here to drink water?" Amy asked curiously. Meg smiled and nodded. "If there is a reason for it to come here, I'm afraid it is. If that's the case, then let's wait here for the rabbit to appear." A smile also appeared on Sivert's face. Perhaps this hunt was going to be easier than she had anticipated. Sam put down the big bag on his back and smiled. "I'll set the trap. The one that ran away last time, I won't make the same mistake this time. There's still an hour and a half until noon. You set the trap, and I'll make lunch." Mag took a look at his watch with a smile before making his way over to a nearby cave with a few pheasants that he had just caught. That was a high vantage point, so it was very suitable for observation. Amy trotted with her short legs to keep up. With everyone's help, the trap was quickly set up around the boulder. Even Meg, who was roasting pheasants and cooking chicken soup, couldn't help but marvel at the series of traps. It was like a piece of art. Everyone retreated from the range of the trap. Sam carried out the final restoration work and then dispelled the aura left behind by everyone. By the time Sam retreated, there were no traces of people around the boulder, nor were there any traces of traps. "Looks like we still have time to eat chicken." Meg smiled as he looked at everyone crawling into the cave. "This smells so good. Mr. Mack, if it weren't for the fact that we can't afford to hire you, I would invite you to join our mercenary group and cook for us every day." Dennis took a deep breath and praised. Everyone couldn't help but salivate at the sight of the crispy golden roast chicken on the grill, the thick white chicken soup that Mag had pulled out from somewhere, and the rich aroma wafting through the air. "I'm not eating. I brought my own food," Evan said in a cold and haughty voice. Eva tried her best to shift her gaze away from the roast pheasants and said with a disdainful expression, "I'm not eating either. Roast pheasants, 1 pheasant for each of us. After eating, you can even drink a bowl of thick chicken soup." Meg didn't even look at the two of them and handed out bowls to everyone with a smile. He then gestured for everyone to take their own roast pheasants and handed an entire roast pheasant to Amy. These two bitches wanted him to make roast pheasants for them. They must have been hit in the head by a door. Evan's expression stiffened at the same time, and his facial muscles twitched as he looked at Meg, who had completely ignored them, and he almost couldn't contain the anger in his heart. "Mage Evan, have some fruit." Eva took out an orange from her backpack and carefully peeled it before handing it to Evan. "I'm not hungry." Evan raised his hand, and the orange fell to the ground. He then turned around with a dark expression. Eva withdrew her hand awkwardly, but there was no hint of anger on her face. Instead, she looked at Evan with an even more cautious expression. Everyone carried over some rocks and sat down. Just the aroma of the roast pheasant was enough to make them drool. Normally, when they came to the wilderness, they would only bring some dried food with them and would never have the opportunity to enjoy something like this. After all, Meg was the best chef in Chaos City. Chul glanced at Evan and Eva, and then at Meg. He hesitated momentarily, but still chose to sit down in silence. He also picked up a roast pheasant and took a whiff. A smile appeared on his face, and he broke off a drumstick before taking a bite. Under the crispy skin, there was a tender and juicy chicken meat. The aroma seeped into the skin, and the roast pheasant's delicious flavor was brought out to the extreme. It was delicious and crispy, and all of the taste buds on the tongue were trembling. "This roast pheasant is so delicious." Chawil's eyes were twinkling like little stars. It was as delicious as Meg's roast beef last time. Pheasants were the most common wild animal in the wilderness, and they would occasionally catch them to satisfy their hunger. However, even Sam, who was the best at roast pheasant, could not compare to Meg's roast pheasant. Moreover, this was roasted in the wilderness under such poor conditions and in such a hurry. If it was in his kitchen, it would be even more delicious. "Oh my God, Mr. Mack, I think you're the god of cookery. No one can make food as delicious as yours. If we can catch a golden scale deer this time, I must go to Mr. Mack's restaurant for a few meals. Count me in." Everyone praised Meg as they ate, and their faces were full of happiness. Meg smiled. As a chef, the greatest sense of accomplishment was naturally from the recognition of his customers. He would never get tired of hearing praise. The whole pot of chicken soup was finished until not even the bones were left. Everyone burped one after another. A ray of sunlight fell on the edge of the basin and then began to move toward the center. Chapter 898. "Sho, look, what did I find?" "Little Lulu is there," Amy whispered, pointing to the cave on the opposite cliff. "That's it, the golden scale deer." Sam's eyes lit up with excitement, but he still lowered his voice and said, "Everyone, find a rock and hide." The golden scale deer is very vigilant and timid. If it finds us, it probably won't come here again. This is an adult golden scale deer, and its fur is of the best quality. Hearing this, everyone hid behind the rocks, carefully watching the golden scale deer. Their eyes were filled with amazement. Mag was also rather surprised to see this. The deer was about the same size as a normal Sika deer, but its body was covered in a layer of shimmering golden scales that resembled fish scales. Under the light of the sun, the scales shimmered like fireworks, and there was a pair of curved horns on its head that seemed to have been forged from pure gold. It was the type of creature that attracted all attention as soon as it appeared. The sunlight was like a curtain that was gradually being lifted, slowly moving forward under the basin. The dark basin was illuminated, and the dampness was suppressed by the sunlight. The little beasts crawled out of their caves and looked up, enjoying the short period of sunlight shining on them. The giant rock was also illuminated by the sun with a little bit of golden light, as if it was sprinkled with golden powder. The clear spring in the middle was also rippling with dazzling light. The golden scale deer's big black eyes scanned the surroundings vigilantly. It waited for 10 minutes until the sun covered the whole basin, then carefully jumped down from the steep cliff. The cliff was almost vertical, with only a few protruding rocks, but the golden scale deer jumped directly from the cliff, landing lightly and accurately on the protruding rocks. It was like a little fairy jumping down from the cliff. After landing on the ground, the golden scale deer stopped again, vigilantly observing the boulders and the surroundings. It stopped every 3 steps, its ears twitching, as if it was observing the surroundings at all times. Sivir gripped the boomerang hanging from her waist and said in a low voice, "Even though Sam has set up a series of traps, be prepared to attack as a safety precaution. Remember, it's best not to damage its fur or horn. Otherwise, the price will be drastically reduced." Everyone silently pulled out their weapons, staring at the golden scale deer that was slowly walking toward the boulder. The cave was about 10 meters above the boulder, which was the best place to launch a long-range attack. At the same time, it was also very easy to go down. It was the perfect place for an ambush. "Are we going to attack?" Amy rubbed her little hands with an excited expression on her little face. 2 small flames had already begun to dance on her little hands. "Amy, you can't use the fireball magic. If you get burnt, we'll have come here for nothing." Mag stroked her hair helplessly. "Is that so?" Amy thought for a moment, and 2 ice flames appeared on her hands. The temperature of the cave dropped a lot. The people squatting in front could not help but look back at the ice flames in Amy's hands. Their eyes were full of admiration. To be able to cast such a terrifying spell at such a young age, Amy's achievements in the future were beyond their imagination. Evan's eyes also twitched, although he didn't want to admit it. He could feel the energy in the ice flames that terrified him. Even though he had broken through to become a true intermediate mage, he still couldn't release ice magic with such energy. Moreover, there was a big gap between them, and the one who could do all this was a 4-year-old half-elf. A deep sense of frustration rose spontaneously. Of course, the most important thing was that this guy was also a fire mage. Meg glanced at the ice flames in Amy's hands and did not say anything. Among the people present, no one was more suitable than Amy to subdue the golden scale deer without damaging its fur. After all, a short freeze would not hurt its fur. As for Meg, after the thunder outside the City of Chaos last night, his strength had returned to the level of a 6th-tier knight. Of course, he would not fight. It was very unwise to expose his strength for a golden scale deer. Of course, if there was a chance, he would like to find some weaklings to test his sword on. After leveling up twice, he had to practice well. The golden scale deer was getting closer and closer to the boulder. It was about to step into the trap. Scott and Skull were ready to charge. Chiwell held the boomerang in his hand behind him. His body was a little tense, as if he was going to throw it out at any time. On the ground in front of the boulder, the moist sand was no different from usual. A few withered leaves fell on it, as if they had just fallen from a tree. The golden scale deer sniffed the ground and seemed to hesitate. Then it looked up at the spring in the middle of the boulder, hesitated for a moment, and jumped forward. The flat ground suddenly sank like quicksand, and a big hole appeared in the ground. It seemed that the golden-scaled deer would lose all its support in an instant. "Got it?" Dennis's face lit up. Amy looked up and said with a smile, "Not yet. Little Lulu is holding on to the edge. She hasn't fallen yet." Everyone looked at the pit that had suddenly appeared. The golden-scaled deer did not fall directly into the pit as expected. Its two front hooves grabbed onto the edge of the pit, and it held on to the edge of the pit so that it did not fall. "Follow the plan," Sivers said softly. She grabbed a vine and jumped off the cliff like a bird. She used her legs to cushion the fall and threw the boomerang in her hand. Her target was the legs of the golden-scaled deer that were hanging on the edge of the trap. Scott and Skoll also grabbed onto the vines and slid down. Evan stood up and began to chant a spell. Blue light began to converge on his wand, and he pointed it downward, upon which a layer of ice began to materialize above the trap. However, before Scott and Skoll could land, the golden-scaled deer let out a loud moan and jumped out of the trap with its legs. Bang! The ice cover that had not yet fully formed was smashed into pieces. The boomerang brushed past the deer's butt and hit the edge of the trap. Chapter 899. Only by thinking of all the possible changes that could occur could this be called a qualified serial trap. Sam's family had been hunters for generations. Although it was not enough to deal with powerful magical beasts, it was effective against magical beasts that were not very aggressive and destructive. However, the golden-scaled deer, which had just escaped from the trap, was obviously not willing to give up. The boomerang whistled again. The two humans who had landed on the ground and were rushing toward it with long swords, and the ice walls rising in all directions. The golden-scaled deer's eyes flashed with a hint of ferocity. "Ow!" With a sharp cry, the golden-scaled deer's golden scales suddenly stood up. The sun fell on the scales, reflecting a dazzling golden light that shot in all directions. The net that covered the deer instantly turned into charred ropes, as if it had been burned by fire. The ice walls around it were cut into countless pieces. Looking in that direction, the crowd subconsciously avoided the golden light. They could not help but have a trace of confusion in their eyes, as if they had seen something wonderful. Some of them stood there in a daze. "Is this an illusion?" A hint of surprise appeared on Mag's face as he looked at Evan, who was still in the middle of casting his spell, and Eva, who was still staring blankly into space. His spiritual power seemed to be too powerful, so he wasn't affected in the slightest. Miss Leatherpants and the others are also stunned. It's like they're made of wood, but in this case, that little Lulu is going to escape. Amy poked her head out and pointed at the golden-scaled deer, which had just crawled out of the trap group and was a little lame in its right foreleg. Although surprised that Amy was not affected at all, Meg glanced at the golden-scaled deer that had run dozens of meters away in the blink of an eye and quickly asked, "Amy, can you catch it?" "Of course." Amy nodded, then pointed her little finger at the golden-scaled deer that had almost reached the bottom of the cliff and was about to start climbing. With a serious face, she called out, "Little Lulu, stop." The golden-scaled deer stopped in its tracks, as if it had been immobilized by a spell. "This?" Meg was taken aback. He thought that Amy would use some sort of frost spell, but he didn't expect her to freeze it in place with just a light tap. If they had known this would happen, they wouldn't have spent half an hour setting up the trap and then trying to catch the golden-scaled deer. This is the immobilization technique that Master Julian just taught me. It's also called the domain of extreme frost. Everything in the area will be instantly frozen. Amy explained as she looked at Meg with an expression that said, "Praise me." "Awesome." Meg smiled and patted Amy's head. The little girl was a fast learner, and she often skipped grades to learn more advanced things. Domains were generally something that only magicians above the 7th level could play with. Except for some gifted races without enough understanding of magic and a certain degree of talent, most magicians could not understand what a domain was. Amy was only a 4th level magician, but she had already started to play with domains. If this were to spread, it would probably cause a stir. The golden-scaled deer was immobilized, and the illusion was lifted. Everyone's faces showed a trace of confusion, as if they had forgotten what had just happened. Oh no! The golden scale deer! Sivir was the first to react, and her expression changed slightly as she cast her gaze toward the trap, only to find that it was completely empty. Everyone came back to their senses when they heard this. Their expressions changed slightly. They did not expect that they would fall for the golden scale deer's innate illusion. The golden scale deer that was so close to being in their hands had run away just like that. It's okay. Look over there. Little Lulu has been immobilized by me. Amy's crisp voice sounded, and she pointed at the golden scale deer at the foot of the cliff in the distance. Everyone looked in that direction. The golden scale deer was indeed there. Its front hooves were raised, and its hind hooves were kicked back. It seemed to be in a running state, but at this time, it was motionless, as if it had been immobilized. How is this possible? Evan looked at the golden scale deer. Even his magic had been destroyed by this golden scale deer twice, but it had been immobilized by Amy so easily. He was shocked and a little ashamed. Everyone's faces were full of shock. There was no ice wall, no trace of ice, and not even a trace of the golden scale deer's struggle. What kind of powerful magic could immobilize the golden scale deer so easily? And it was Amy who had done all this. It seems that someone just said that some people would only watch from the sidelines. Uncle, is that you? Amy looked at the gloomy Evan and asked with a smile. Humph. Evan's face alternated between red and white, and he turned his head away angrily. Eva opened her mouth, but after looking at Amy, she closed it, but there was still some resentment in her eyes. A faint smile appeared on Mag's face. As expected, he was more pleased to see Amy's performance than to Flex. He turned to Sivir and said, "It's only immobilized. It's not dead, so it's best if you can tie it up as soon as possible." Okay. Chiwil untied a roll of rope with some complicated runes hanging from his waist and walked quickly to the golden scale deer. He quickly put the rope around its neck, tied all 4 of its feet together, and put it on the ground. This was a spirit-binding rope made by a magician. It was one of the most common equipment used by mercenaries. Magic beasts that were bound by the spirit-binding rope would lose their ability to struggle. Therefore, the spirit-binding rope was a very good tool when capturing magic beasts alive. Ow, ow. The golden scale deer regained consciousness and struggled desperately on the ground, but it could not move the spirit-binding rope at all. Chiwil smiled and stood up. He could not help but shiver. He rubbed his hands and said, "Oh, it's so cold." The temperature in this area was much lower than the surrounding area. It was like a frozen land. Great! This mission was all thanks to Mr. Mac and little Amy. They successfully caught the most difficult level 3 magical beast to catch, Dennis said excitedly. That's right. I didn't expect that guy's illusion talent to be so powerful. All of us fell for it. Even my trap couldn't catch it, Sam said with a sigh. Everyone went down the cave and looked at the golden scale deer curiously. A magical beast worth 200,000 copper coins. If it was an ordinary magical beast, it would be at least a level 6 magical beast. Chapter 900. The shrill laughter echoed in the empty basin like that of a ghost. The mercenaries, who were still immersed in the joy of their harvest, were startled. They immediately got into their battle stances and looked up in surprise. There were 7 people on the cliff above. Although they looked very small due to the great height difference, it was still obvious that they were a team of demons, orcs, and forest trolls. The tall guy in the middle, who was burning with ghostly green flames, was especially chilling. Get ready to fight. Sivir gripped the boomerang tightly in her hand as she looked up with a grave expression at the people who had appeared above her. There was an old saying among the mercenaries: magic beasts are not scary, but mercenaries who have their eyes on you are scary. Those who dared to target mercenaries were usually far more powerful than the other party. Under such circumstances, the weaker party was basically powerless. However, because of the strong intervention of the City Lord's castle and the Grey Temple in Chaos City, there were few conflicts among the mercenaries. Even if there were conflicts over magic beasts or herbs, most of them were settled with fair duels. However, It was clear that many of these mercenaries had their eyes on the golden scale deer they had caught. What do they mean? Eva's voice was trembling, and her face was very pale. Those words made her think of some terrible things. These guys. I'm afraid they are coming for us. Evan's face was also very pale, and his eyes were full of fear. Thinking of what had happened in the past few days, and the gruesome corpses of the mercenaries who had been carried back to Chaos City, the mercenaries' faces were very grim. They are still coming. That guy should be an 8th-tier demon, right? Meg looked up. His eyes were far sharper than ordinary people. His gaze lingered on the demon with ghostly flames for a while, and then swept over the orcs and forest trolls beside him. Most of them were between 6th tier and 7th tier. With such strength, they could easily wipe out all the mercenary groups in the wilderness, unless they encountered some big boss who needed to find something in the wilderness. The combination of demons, beast men, and forest trolls, as well as the insulting title of Piggy, all of this proved that these fellows were the culprits behind the recent massacre of the mercenary groups. In other words, they were the evil mercenary groups that specifically targeted wandering elves. Aimi covered her ears and raised her head to shout, "What a horrible laugh. Can you please shut up?" The laughter stopped abruptly. The demon lowered his head and looked at Amy. His face was covered in a dark green flame, and he stared at her with a pair of scarlet eyes. "You are so ugly. Can you please cover your face?" Amy said disdainfully. The demon was covered in flames. He roared, "Little brat, I know you are, but if you piss me off, I will make you wish you were dead." As soon as he finished speaking, the demon took a step forward and jumped down from above, diving down like a blue fireball. The demons, orcs, and trolls also quickly climbed down the cliff and rushed down at an extremely fast speed. "Release the signal flare, monkey!" Chewel didn't appear to be panicking. Instead, he calmly issued an order. However, his hand was a little pale from holding the boomerang too tightly. "All right." The monkey's hands trembled as he took out a small bamboo tube from his pocket. The gray temple symbol was printed on it, and he pulled it toward the sky. A magical fireball flew out of the bamboo tube and flew into the sky with a whoosh. It then exploded into a ball of bright red flames in the air and didn't dissipate. "How dare you piss him off? None of us are going to live now." Evan glowered at Amy with a twisted expression. "Don't tell me I'm going to be a coward like you. Not even daring to fart?" Meg stood in front of Amy and looked at Evan with a mocking expression. This guy was even worse than he had imagined. "You!" Evan's face was flushed red, and his wand was already glowing with blue light. "Shut up. Focus and prepare to fight." Chewel looked back at Evan with disgust in his eyes. A guy who blamed his teammates in the face of a strong enemy would never be a reliable teammate. "Uncle, do you want to have a taste of the fireball? Or is it the smell of ice hockey?" Aimi poked her head out and asked with a smile. Evan's expression changed several times, and he withdrew his wand in the end. He looked at the ball of green flames descending from the sky with horror in his eyes, and he had completely lost all of his will to fight. Boom! The green fireball hit the ground 10 meters away from them, shaking the ground. Dust and debris flew everywhere, and the surrounding stone walls fell. Everyone swayed a little before they could steady themselves. The golden scale deer that was tied up by the spirit-binding rope was scared to death. Dennis, who was standing in front of everyone with his shield, was knocked back a meter by the impact. He couldn't help but spit out a mouthful of blood. Cha-cha-cha, accompanied by the sound of stones being crushed. Everyone's hearts were in their throats. To be able to jump down from a cliff that was hundreds of meters high and remain unscathed, one had to be at least a level 7 existence. Furthermore, it had to be a demon with an extremely powerful body. Today, the Rose Mercenary Squad could not avoid the fate of being wiped out. The footsteps finally stopped, and a 3-meter-tall, pitch-black and shriveled demon appeared before everyone. Its body was riddled with indentations, and all of them were burning with ghostly green willow wisps. It was almost like a skeleton with a layer of skin on it. It looked at everyone with a grin and said, "It's useless to release the signal flare. By the time those idiots from the Grey Temple get here, you'll already be dead." Everyone's heart skipped a beat. They had encountered the worst outcome. This one is really weak. It's even weaker than the old thing from 2 days ago. Is Chaos City full of useless people? Where did they get the guts to go against us so openly? Yeah, but the quality this time is not bad. A male piglet is good enough to make up the numbers. That high-quality piglet can be sold at a sky-high price. No matter if it's sent to Rodu or the Demon Islands, it will definitely be sold at an auction. It's not just the piglet. The two women today are not bad either. The one over there has big breasts and a round butt. Looks like she will last longer than the ones from 2 days ago. The one over there will probably die after one use. The rest of the orcs and trolls had also reached the bottom of the basin. They gathered around and commented on the group. Their greedy eyes swept over Amy and Chi Will and scrupulously. The members of the Rose mercenary squad could not hide their anger. Scott and Skull held their long swords tightly, and Dennis stood in front of them with his shield. He had no intention of backing down. Eva's face was as white as a sheet. She subconsciously leaned against Evan and clutched the corner of his shirt tightly. Chapter 901. Evan, Sivir, and the other members of the Rose mercenary group were shocked. They had fought side by side with Sivir many times, and the main magician of the Rose mercenary group had chosen to betray them at a time like this. Eva was flung to the ground by Evan. Lying on the ground, she looked at the demon who was kneeling in front of him, begging for mercy, and even wanted to give them to him as playthings. She felt as if she had been struck by lightning. The great hero in her heart, the powerful magician in his white robe, the handsome elf who was knowledgeable and extraordinary, and the man who she had given her everything to, at this moment, his image in her heart collapsed in an instant, and she fell into an endless abyss. How bad could a person be to do such a thing? In the face of life and death, she finally saw what kind of scum was hidden under those blinded things. Eva grinned, but she smiled. She seemed to have forgotten what it was like to cry. Meg pressed a button in his pocket and picked up Amy. He looked at Eva calmly, without any pity. Then his eyes fell on Evan, and a trace of murderous intent flashed in his eyes. "Beg me to let you go?" The demon looked down at Evan, who was kneeling in front of him, with great interest. He rarely saw such an obedient elf. Thinking of this, he stretched out a foot and grinned. "Lick it clean, and I'll let you live." Evan raised his head to look at the foot in front of him, and a strong stench of a corpse wafted toward him. It was as if the foot had just been scooped out of a pool of corpse water and was stained with a lot of damp soil. Without any hesitation, Evan knelt on the ground and took 2 steps forward before licking the foot with his tongue. Shameless! Scott clenched his long sword, his face full of anger. The other mercenaries had the same expression. They couldn't wait to draw their swords and kill this traitor. "Hey, Uncle, does Lassie's foot smell good?" Amy, who was in Meg's arms, asked curiously. Evan, who was licking vigorously, suddenly stiffened. However, he quickly continued licking as if he was not affected in the slightest. The wisp had a look of enjoyment on its face as it allowed Evan to lick it. It wasn't in a hurry to attack. In the giant valley 5 or 6 kilometers away, there were many mercenary groups looking for herbs. Most of the mercenaries were weak and couldn't beat the powerful magical beasts. They could only come to the giant valley to try their luck. "Look, what's that?" At this time, on the cliff near the exit of the valley, a mercenary who was picking herbs discovered the red flames in the direction of the basin and exclaimed, "It's a flare!" It was the signal flare issued by the Grey Temple today. Could it be that another mercenary group was attacked? No way. They're so close to us. Will they come over? Where are the people from the Grey Temple and the City Lord's castle? Have they not arrived yet? Did another mercenary group get wiped out? The news quickly spread throughout the giant valley, causing a huge commotion and panic. However, a few of the stronger mercenary groups quickly formed teams. Dozens of mercenaries rushed towards the basin to provide assistance. Signal flares rose into the sky, dyeing the sky red. It was particularly eye-catching in the wilderness. "Oh no! Someone's been attacked again. Send the signal to gather everyone in the direction of the giant valley." Branley was one of the leaders of the secret search team. He happened to be near the giant valley, and his expression changed immediately when he saw the signal flare. Another signal flare rose into the sky and exploded into a golden arrow in the air, pointing directly in the direction of the giant valley. In the wilderness, countless members of the Grey Temple were hiding in the giant valley. Of course, there were also mercenary groups who gave up on their mercenary missions and rushed towards the giant valley. No one knew if they could make it in time, but they all knew that the enemy was definitely powerful. However, as a citizen of Chaos City, no one could sit back and watch such a thing happen. Evan licked the willow, the wisp demon's big foot, until there was not a trace of dirt left. He then looked up at the demon with a hopeful expression. The demon wiped the foot on Evan's face with a satisfied expression. He nodded and said, "Very good. I've never seen such an obedient elf like you. I didn't want to kill you, but I've decided to keep you by my side from now on. It's very comfortable." All of the surrounding demons and orcs also burst into laughter as they looked at Evan with a mocking expression. Evan's face flushed red immediately, but he held it all back and put on a flattering smile again. He looked at the fiend and said, "It's my fortune to be able to stay by your side and sleep with you, sir." Dennis spat on the ground and looked at Evan with disgust as he said, "What a spineless guy. Even if you survive, you'll only lick someone's foot for the rest of your life. A real man wouldn't do such a thing. You can be a bootlicker for the rest of your life. We'll laugh even if we die." Scott looked at Evan with a mocking smile. Chiwa looked at Evan with disgust. She should have refused to let him join the Rose mercenary group. Now, he had completely tarnished the Rose mercenary group. If the Rose mercenary group was destroyed here, she didn't know how to explain it to her father, who had given it to her. Evan felt the stares, and his face was full of madness. He knelt on the ground and crawled a few steps toward the demon. He said in a trembling voice, "Master, kill them. Kill these noisy bastards. Then take these two women away. That woman must be very comfortable to use. And that kid, take that kid too. It's about time. Those fools from the Grey Temple should be on their way, right? It's really fun to play with them." The ghost fire demon kicked Evan to the side and licked his lips. Looking at the mercenary group that was still in the defensive formation, he said with a smile, "Now, it's your turn. Who should I start with?" The vigilance on everyone's faces intensified, and a poison dagger was already hidden in Siver's left sleeve. Only Eva was still lying on the ground in a daze. Her eyes were glazed over, and she wore an expression that seemed to be both crying and laughing at the same time. After looking around, the demon's gaze landed on Mag. His smile widened as he pointed at Mag. "You, bring that little piglet over and give it to me personally. Then lick my other leg clean, and I will spare your life." "What if I refuse?" Meg frowned. "Then you'll die, and she'll still be mine." The demon looked at Meg and grinned, revealing a row of sharp teeth. "I refuse," Meg said calmly. "Then you're dead." The demon reached out his right hand to Meg. A ball of green willow, the wisp condensed in his palm. "Kill him. Kill them all?" Evan, who was holding his stomach and unable to get up, looked at Meg and shouted crazily, "Protect them!" Chiwil shouted and raised the boomerang in his hand. Oh, just then a loud cry sounded in the air. A huge body swooped down like a bolt of purple lightning, leaving behind a purple afterimage. "How?" The demon's expression changed drastically. He wanted to raise his head. However, it was too late. A pair of sharp claws pierced through the demon's body and lifted him up into the air. With a rip, he was torn in half. Blood and willow, the wisp filled the sky. Chapter 902. The dozens of mercenaries were still hurrying from the giant valley to the basin. The distance of 5 to 6 kilometers didn't seem to be very far, but the mountain roads were extremely treacherous, and even unicorns couldn't run very fast. "Look, what's that?" Someone in the group suddenly exclaimed as he pointed toward the basin. All of the mercenaries turned toward that direction with astonishment etched on their faces. A griffin plunged into the basin like a bolt of purple lightning, then took to the air again in an instant before tearing a humanoid object in half with its sharp claws. That? That's a purple-striped griffin. Could that be Alex, legendary griffin? Is there a second one on the Northern continent? That's a mutated 10th-tier lightning griffin that was tamed by Alex, and it only listens to him. I didn't think that it would appear here. Seeing as Master Alex is here, then there's no need to worry. All of the mercenaries were discussing spiritedly among themselves, and all of them were feeling a lot more relieved. However, they didn't slow down in the slightest. Even if they couldn't help, it would still be a great boast if they could witness Alex in battle. Alex really is a man of his word. Branley had already arrived at the giant valley, and he looked toward the basin with a gratified expression. All of the Grey Temple members wore different expressions, but all of them were slightly relieved. Master, this is the responsibility of our Grey Temple, after all. If Alex interferes, won't the reputation of our Grey Temple be? A magic caster beside Branley said in a soft voice. The Grey Temple's reputation was built up by the seniors of the Grey Temple who fought to the death for the safety of Chaos City. They sacrificed their lives to protect the citizens of Chaos City. It won't be affected just because someone protected the citizens before the Grey Temple. Branley looked at that magic caster with a cold expression and said, I feel like you're degrading the reputation of the Grey Temple by saying something like that. The magic caster blushed as he hurriedly lowered his head and said, My apologies. Reinforcements were still on the way, and everyone in the basin was completely astonished by the sight of green willow, the wisps and dark green blood flying through the air. The 8th-rank demon, which was so powerful that it made people despair, was torn to pieces so easily. It didn't even struggle. A head with wide eyes fell from the sky and rolled right in front of Evan. The pair of dead fish eyes seemed to still be looking at him. Evan took a few steps back in horror and looked at the head in disbelief. Dark green blood drenched his body, making him look very pathetic. Just now, he had licked his feet like a dog and was willing to be a slave in exchange for a chance to live. Then, he wanted to kill the woman who embarrassed him and everyone present. And now, this undefeatable Ghostfire demon had been torn to pieces by a griffin. The sudden reversal left him in a daze. He didn't even know if he should be happy about his freedom or sad about his master's death. It's Alex's purple-striped griffin. Scott looked up at the griffin in the sky, and his eyes immediately lit up as he exclaimed, That's right. Could it be that Sir Alex is here? We're saved. The members of the Rose mercenary squad, who were still in shock, were overjoyed. They tightened their defensive perimeter and stopped attacking. When Alex and Irina were roaming the continent, they were known as the bane of bad guys. Since the purple-striped griffin was here, Alex must be nearby. That meant they could survive. Alex, the demons, orcs, and trolls saw the Ghostfire demon torn to pieces, and then looked up at the purple-striped griffin hovering in the sky. They were all terrified. No one knew better than them what Alex and Irina meant when they said the names. Mercenary groups that hunted wandering elves used to wreak havoc on the Northern continent. No one dared to stop them. But because of these two, the mercenary groups that hunted wandering elves have been terrorizing the Northern continent for 3 years. Many of them disbanded and went into hiding to avoid these two murderous gods. And now, these murderous gods had appeared again, right next to them. Even though they hadn't seen him yet, the purple-striped griffin was here, so he must be nearby. Resist? Even the Void Troll's patriarch was killed by him. The strongest among them, the Ghostfire demon, was torn to pieces by the griffin's claws. How could they resist? What right did they have to resist? Take the hostages, a forest troll roared. A black vine flew out from his body, wrapped around Evan, and pulled him to his side. The other 5 came back to their senses. They suppressed their fear and rushed toward the members of the Rose mercenary squad, who were still surrounded. Whether they could survive Alex's attack today depended on these hostages. The griffin lowered its head and looked down at them. It seemed to be angered by their actions. It raised its head and let out a long roar. Howl! Wow, what a beautiful lion! It has wings, and it's purple. But why does it sound so much like Daphne's dog? Amy looked at the purple-striped griffin through Meg's fingers. Her big eyes were bright with excitement. Is it a husky? Meg asked with a smile. Father, how did you know? Have you seen Daphne's stupid dog that tore down her house? Amy looked at Meg in surprise. She whispered, Daphne's grandpa said to make dog soup this winter. Daphne was very sad, but I still asked her to call me when she was cooking. Drinking dog broth in winter is indeed a very comfortable thing. It would be even better if there was dog meat hot pot. Mag nodded in agreement, even though he had only eaten it once. The members of the Rose mercenary squad, who were nervously preparing to deal with the demons and trolls, had strange expressions on their faces. They could still talk about dog soup and dog hot pot under such circumstances. How much did this father and daughter like to eat? Their hearts were so big that it made one's hair stand on end. Meg was calm from beginning to end. This was a trap he had set up. The roles of the prey and the hunter were not clear from beginning to end. Boom! A thunderous explosion. Chapter 903. No! The orcs and demons that were charging at the Rose mercenary squad screamed in agony. 2 orcs and 2 trolls were turned into black charcoal, falling to the ground and disintegrating into ashes. The last demon with a protruding mouth and monkey-like cheeks managed to stop himself at the last moment. His body glowed with light, forcing him to retreat a few meters, barely avoiding the lightning bolt. He screamed in horror, plunged into a nearby cave, and disappeared in the blink of an eye. The griffin looked in the direction of the cave and spat out a lightning ball in annoyance. It blew up the entrance of the cave, and the collapsed boulders sealed the entrance completely. Meg also looked in the direction of the cave, and a smile appeared on his face, but he quickly hid it. So powerful! The Rose mercenary squad members, who were still on guard, heaved a sigh of relief. They looked at the griffin with admiration. If a mount is so powerful, how powerful is Alex, who hasn't shown up yet? They didn't dare to imagine. The remaining forest troll took a couple of steps back in horror. His trembling body was covered in mud and dust. Black vines wrapped around Evan, and a poisonous spike was pressed against his chest. He looked up at the purple-striped griffin and said in a trembling voice, "You don't come any closer. If you come any closer, I'll kill him." The griffin slowly descended until it was about 10 meters above the ground. Its purple-gold eyes looked at the forest troll and Evan, and it seemed to hesitate. The forest troll's face lit up. He was right. With a hostage, Alex wouldn't attack and gave him a chance to live. Evan felt the sharp, poisonous spike in his chest, and his face turned as white as a sheet. The tables had turned too quickly, and he only just came back to his senses. The arrogant and evil mercenary squad was now reduced to a panicked forest troll. Afraid that the griffin didn't understand the situation, he quickly cried out, "Lord Alex, save me. I'm a magic caster from Chaos City, and I'm also an elf. Didn't you say you would protect all the elves outside the Wind Forest? Please save me. Don't act rashly." Seeing that Evan was tactful, the forest troll didn't gag him. Today's operation had gone too smoothly. It was inevitable that they were a little complacent. They had never thought that Alex would really appear. Moreover, they hadn't even seen him. Just a griffin had almost wiped them out. "Tui, you only know that you're a magic caster from Chaos City now? Are you an elf? Could it be that the bootlicker who was licking the demon's feet and saying that he wanted to kill all of us is already dead?" Dennis spat on the ground with a mocking smile. "That's right. In order to survive, this guy is really like a mangy dog," Scott said, curling his lips. The members of the Rose mercenary group looked at Evan with disgust. What he had done before was not just running away, but betraying them. In order to save his own life, he had tried to trade the lives of all the members. Now, looking at him being held by the forest troll with a poisonous spike in his chest, no one pitied him at all. Instead, they felt that he had brought this upon himself. Hearing their words, Evan's face alternated between green and red. He looked around the crowd, and his eyes landed on Eva, who was still lying on the ground with a silly smile. His eyes lit up, and he called out hopefully, "Eva, save me. Eva, help me beg Alex's people. Ask him to save me. Eva, I'll marry you when we go back this time. I know how good you are." I really love you. Eva got up from the ground, and her eyes seemed to have lost all focus. She staggered in another direction and murmured, "Men, liars, all liars, Eva." Evan glared at Eva's back with a ferocious expression. "Eva, I'll take a look." Chua was also slightly startled. He put away his boomerang and chased after Eva. The forest troll's face showed some fear again. The guy in its hands seemed to be the most worthless hostage. The vines around Evan suddenly tightened, and the poisonous spike was almost stuck to his skin. The sudden burst of pain made Evan's face turn red. He cried out in pain, Save me. You'd rather die than live like a dog." Mag snapped his fingers as he looked at Evan, who was twisting and struggling. The purple-striped griffin's eyes suddenly became fierce, and it swooped down on the forest troll like a bolt of lightning. "Let's die together." A crazed look appeared on the forest troll's face, and its poisonous thorns pierced into Evan's heart. Countless poisonous thorns protruded from its massive body that was nearly 5 meters tall, and it instantly expanded like a balloon that was about to explode. Its sharp claws pierced through his throat and pulled out his head. Blood spurted out, and the inflated body became like a deflated balloon. It withered in an instant, and then fell to the ground with a loud crash. The 7 members of the wicked mercenary group, except for one who entered the cave, were all annihilated, including an 8th-tier Ghostfire demon. The members of the Rose mercenary group were shocked speechless. Whoa! The purple-striped griffin circled around the basin and let out an excited cry towards the crowd, as if it was asking for praise. Then, it abruptly raised its head and flew upwards, almost sticking to the stone wall. Like a purple lightning bolt, it disappeared into the small horizon of the basin. So fast. It would be great if I could sit for a while. Amy looked up and said with some longing. Mag patted the little one's head with a smile. Such a wish was easy to fulfill. "This is also my dream." Dennis raised his head and said sympathetically. Meg raised an eyebrow. This wish could not be fulfilled. The purple-striped griffin disappeared into the sky. Alex did not appear from the beginning to the end. However, an opponent like this did not require his help. The basin regained its peace, leaving behind a ground full of corpses and ashes. The small reptiles were still trembling in the cave. The members of the Rose mercenary group smiled, as if they had survived a disaster. Evan died under the forest troll's poisonous spike. His eyes were wide open. However, they did not feel sad about his death. Instead, they felt a sense of satisfaction, as if they had vented their anger. Thinking about how they had been teammates with this guy for 3 months, they still felt a lingering fear. Chiwil brought Eva back, but she did not seem to be in a good state. She seemed to have gone crazy, constantly tearing her hair and muttering, "Man, liar, liar, man." Chapter 904. Everyone in the Rose mercenary squad turned to look at Mag and Amy. The father and daughter who had been talking about eating dog meat seemed to be the calmest people in the entire ordeal. How could they be so calm when they almost died at the hands of a demon? The Grey Temple should be on their way after such a big incident, right? It should be safe nearby. It's still early, so we want to watch the show for a while longer, Mag said to everyone with a smile. Yes, it's fun to watch the show, Amy said, clapping her hands. Sivert turned to Mag with a hint of surprise on her face. If a normal person were to encounter something like this, they would definitely rush back to Chaos City and stay in a safe place. However, the two of them were the exact opposite. They wanted to stay and watch the show. Meg was right. The Grey Temple should be here soon. This was the scene where the killer was killed. It would be the safest place in the entire wilderness. She nodded. Okay, but what do you want to do with the golden scale deer, Mr. Meg? This was the biggest reward of their trip. Evan was dead, and Eva had gone crazy. This was a big blow to the Rose mercenary squad. With this money, they might be able to find a good magician and healer. Mag glanced at the dead golden scale deer and said, "According to our plan, I'll take this pair of horns, and the rest will be left to young Mistress Sivert." Okay, Chiwil nodded. She walked quickly to the golden scale deer and squatted down. She pulled out a dagger from her waist and cut off 2 golden horns that were about 30 centimeters long. She handed them to Meg. After everything is done, I'll send half of the reward to your restaurant, Mr. Meg. Thank you. Mag nodded. He liked this kind of girl who could save him trouble and worry. He stuffed the 2 golden horns into his bag. Sivert turned to everyone and said, the Grey Temple will definitely need our cooperation in their investigation. Monkey, you and I'll take Eva back first. Everyone else, wait here for a while. These guys are most likely not all of them. If we can help the Grey Temple eliminate all of the murderers, then that would be a good thing. Okay. The others nodded. Monkey picked up the golden scale deer and followed Chi-Will, who was holding Eva's hand, to a path up the cliff. Bye, Sister Leatherpants. Amy waved at Chi-Will. Bye, little Amy. Chi-Will waved. You guys should be enough to explain the situation. We'll go up first. It's higher, so we'll have a better view. Bye, everyone. Meg smiled at the others, holding Amy in his arms. The others nodded with a strange expression. Boss Mag, we've been through life and death situations together. Can you give us a discount the next time we come to eat at your restaurant? Dennis asked with a smile. That won't do. Meg shook his head and smiled. But if you're free on a day off, I'll treat you to a meal. I'll make the wine and cook the food. They continued westward and finally stopped beside a cliff. Father, where are the big bad guys? Amy looked around curiously. We need a cool steed. Meg looked up into the sky. How? Chapter 905. It's that big lion that can fly. Amy's eyes lit up as she exclaimed in surprise. The griffin, which was originally charging towards Meg excitedly, heard Amy's words and began to decelerate. It landed on the cliff and circled around before flying back up again. It stopped at a height of about 10 meters and looked at Amy in bewilderment. It was as if it was looking at a scary person, but at the same time, it wanted to get closer to her. Meg was both surprised and amused. Who would have thought that such a big guy would be scared by Amy? Ozzy, come down. Meg raised his head and called out to the purple-striped griffin. Ow! Ozzy looked at Meg, then at Amy, and carefully descended. Ozzy? That's such a cute name. Amy blinked and looked at Meg curiously. Father, do you know it? Yes, it's an old friend. Meg nodded with a smile. He looked at the purple-striped griffin, who was as timid as a dog, and couldn't help but feel angry and amused at the same time. It was not cool at all. It didn't look as mighty as when it tore the demon apart with its bare hands. Instead, it looked more like a fool. He said in a louder voice, Ozzy, come down. After lingering in midair for a while, the purple-striped griffin landed gently on the cliff. Even though it was looking at Amy with a wary expression, it still couldn't help but lean its head toward Mag and rub its head against his shoulder as if it were trying to curry favor with him. Wow, it's so obedient. I want to pet Ozzy's head too. Amy's eyes lit up as she reached out her little hand towards Ozzy's head. But before Amy's little hand could reach its head, the purple-striped griffin shrank its head back. Its eyes were wide open, and it looked as if it was about to be murdered. Meg looked at the purple-striped griffin. He still didn't know why it was so afraid of her. He comforted, Ozzy, this is Amy, my daughter. She's very kind. Lil Ozzy, be good. Give me your head. Amy looked at the purple-striped griffin, then took out her staff, which was taller than a person, and said with a smile, Otherwise, I'll blow your head off. The purple-striped griffin seemed to be frightened, and it immediately stretched its head over to Amy's hand. Good girl. Amy stroked the purple-striped griffin's trembling head, and the smile on her face was as bright as the light from her magic caster's staff. Meg! This was an unconventional first meeting. However, Mag also smiled at the sight of the purple-striped griffin, which had already stopped trembling and was beginning to enjoy itself. Although she wasn't sure why Amy was so intimidating in Z's heart, it didn't seem to be a big problem at the moment. Amy stroked Ozzy's furry head and looked at Meg curiously as she asked, Father, were you the one who commanded little Ozzy to kill all those bad guys? You could say that. Meg nodded. I told you Father is super awesome. Even your little pet is so powerful. Amy's expression was a little excited, but she soon sighed and said, "But ugly duckling is too fat. Even if it becomes a white swan in the end, it'll definitely be a super fat white swan, the kind that can only roll on the ground." Meg imagined that scene, and the smile on his face widened. He put Amy on the ground and took out 2 sets of black clothes from his bag. "We're going to kill all the remaining bad guys now, and then rescue the people they've captured. However, the truly powerful heroes never let others know their true faces, so we have to disguise ourselves." Amy's eyes lit up, and she asked curiously, "Is it like those legends? A hero wearing a mask saves people in trouble, but doesn't leave his name behind." "Yes, so we can't tell anyone what we're doing today, and we can't make any noise during the battle." Meg looked at Amy with a serious expression and asked, "Can you do it, little hero Amy?" "I can." Amy nodded with a serious expression. "Very good. Then let's set off." Meg put on the black windbreaker for Amy, and then put on a small black and white mask for her. After that, he also put on all his equipment and jumped onto the griffin's back with Amy in his arms. "Let's go, Ozzy. Let's go to those guys' nest." Meg patted the griffin's back gently. "Let's go." Amy yelled with joy as she spread open her arms. The griffin spread its wings and soared into the sky, disappearing in the blink of an eye, leaving behind a trembling horse that was tied to the cliff. At the bottom of the basin, the people of the Grey Temple were studying the crime scene, trying to find some useful information from the bodies and ashes. Some were also cleaning up the collapsed cave entrance. Meanwhile, Branley and a few other Grey Temple members were interrogating the Rose mercenary squad members. They were the ones who had experienced the incident, and were also the first batch of people to survive the attack. "Sir, it's just as we said. The demon escaped into the cave, but the entrance was destroyed by the purple-striped griffin's lightning ball. We don't know if he was killed, or if he escaped from the cave. However, these caves are very spacious, and many of them are connected. If he escaped, I'm afraid it'll be very difficult to catch him," Dennis said to Branley. He still felt a lingering fear as he thought back to what had just happened. Branley nodded and said, "Thank you for your hard work. The Grey Temple will take care of everything here. You can all go back to Chaos City to rest. If necessary, we may need your cooperation in the investigation." "All right, this concerns the safety of us mercenaries. We'll do our best to cooperate." Everyone hurriedly nodded solemnly. "Over here!" Suddenly, there was a cry of alarm from the digging cave. The combat personnel quickly rushed forward. Soon, a black demon with smoke coming out of his mouth after being struck by lightning was carried out by several spirit binding ropes. One of his legs was crushed by a huge rock, and he was on the verge of death. Branley stepped forward and coldly said to the demon, "Reattach his life, then pry open his mouth and find out where they're hiding." About 15 kilometers west of the basin was a mountain. To the west of the mountain was a nearly vertical cliff, forming a misty valley with the mountain on the other side. The dense fog enshrouded the entire valley, and no one could be seen beyond a few meters. At the bottom of the valley, there was a lush forest. It had been thousands of years since anyone had disturbed this place, and trees as thick as a man's arm could be seen everywhere. Chapter 906. What a thick fog! Amy followed Mag down from the griffin's back and grabbed a handful of mist as she asked with a curious expression, "That's right. Yeah, it's not easy to find a place like this." Meg nodded as he squinted at the thick fog. His sharp eyes pierced through the fog, and his vision far exceeded that of a normal person's. He could still clearly see things 100 meters away. A 10th-tier powerful being should be able to see through this level of fog. Meg looked down at Amy with a serious expression and said, "Amy, our main mission is to rescue the hostages and protect ourselves at the same time. We have to make sure no one discovers who we are, so you only need to use your domain of extreme frost. Leave the rest to me, okay?" "Okay." Amy nodded. Meg turned to Ozzy and said, "Ozzy, you'll be in charge of keeping an eye on and capturing anyone who tries to escape." Ozzy also nodded, although it didn't quite understand what kind of person could escape from Meg. "Let's go." Meg said softly as he rushed into the depths of the forest with his sword in hand. He drew his sword halfway out of its sheath before sheathing it again. A demon hiding in the trees silently fell to the ground, and its head fell to the ground with a confused look in its eyes. A pair of small golden wings appeared on Amy's back, and she followed Meg through the trees without making any sound. Her large eyes were filled with admiration as she looked at Meg's back. A silent slaughter was carried out in the forest. Meg killed all of the scouts and sentries scattered throughout the forest, and he quickly made his way to the center of the forest. In the depths of the forest, near the center of the canyon, there was a large cave in the cliff. There were a few wooden huts at the entrance of the cave, and a dozen or so orcs and demons were patrolling the area with nervous expressions. In the depths of the cave, in a separate and empty cave, a young orc looked at a muscular orc with a frightened expression and said in a sobbing voice, "Masterson, what do we do now? Captain Willow, the Wisp, and the others should all be dead." Alex really made his move. That purple-striped griffin tore Captain Willow, the Wisp, into pieces. Too terrifying. It's like tearing apart a chicken. Will we be discovered here? Let's run. Shut up. The orc called Xeon roared angrily as he paced back and forth in the cave. Although he tried his best to maintain a calm expression, his trembling hands revealed his current mood. Alex had made a move. This was something that no one had expected. Moreover, he had directly destroyed the main fighting force of their mercenary group. Now, in the encampment, besides him, who was at level 7, there were only 2 level 6 mercenaries left. The rest of the members were all below level 6. However, if Alex really found this place, there would be no difference between level 7 and level 1. Anyway, he wouldn't be able to withstand his sword. One had to realize that even the patriarch of the spatial trolls had been slain by Alex with a single sword strike. There was most likely no one on the Norland continent who dared to claim that they were more powerful than Alex. He was very panicked, but he knew that he couldn't show it. Otherwise, everyone would want to run, and he wouldn't be able to succeed. Someone had to die. He had been in this line of work for over 20 years, and had seen the glory days and the dark ages brought on by Alex and Irina. As such, he was well aware of the inevitable fate that would befall a mercenary group that had been targeted by Alex. "How many people have you talked to about this?" Xeon asked the young orc. The orc gulped and replied, "Most of them should have already known. However, I didn't say that Alex was the one who did it." "Very good." Xeon patted the orc's shoulder before covering his mouth with his hand. A black bone dagger protruded from his back. The young orc's eyes widened, and he died without uttering a single sound. "You were a junior that I had high hopes for, but unfortunately, I also wanted to live." Xeon's voice was trembling slightly as he placed the orc on the ground. He wiped the blood from his hand on the orc's body and walked out of the cave with a giant axe. The heavy stone door slowly closed behind him, and he quickly walked out of the cave. The massive cave had been excavated into a series of small and sealed caves. Many of the caves were still empty, but there were also some that had been tortured by elves. They were curled up in a corner and didn't dare to raise their heads even when they heard the sound. They only dared to sneak a peek out of the corner of their eyes, praying that the footsteps wouldn't stop in front of their doors. Despair and fear shrouded their hearts. They had seen with their own eyes the cruel deaths of their comrades who had fought side by side with them countless times. They had seen the captured women being tortured to death in every possible way. They had also suffered all kinds of torture and were locked in this dark little cave. They did not know what they were going to face next. There were already some elves who had committed suicide because they couldn't stand the torture. The elves who were still alive were fearful of death, but there was a glimmer of hope that they would be saved. They firmly believed that Chaos City wouldn't abandon them. No one knew how long they could last. Another female elf had been found to have committed suicide this morning, so they were all tied up with spirit-binding ropes and gagged in their mouths. They couldn't even bite off their tongues to commit suicide. The demons and orcs were patrolling back and forth in the passageway, and any strange movements could result in a vicious beating and sexual assault. Xeon arrived at the entrance of the cave and looked at the dozen or so demons and orcs standing there as he said, The team leader and the deputy team leader have all been killed by the Grey Temple. The situation is very urgent, and we have to prepare to evacuate. Go and gather everyone here, and then kill all of the elves and women. Get ready to leave this place. Everyone's expressions changed slightly upon hearing the news. The team leader who had just left had told them to prepare some women and fine wine, and now he was dead. It was far too sudden. A hesitant demon asked, Master Xion, even if we're going to evacuate, why don't we take those elves with us? They're the last of our mercenary group's assets. We can sell them off on the demon islands, and we'll be able to live a good life for a while. A forest troll chimed in, Indeed. The team leader and the others are all dead, so our mercenary group is most likely going to disband. Why don't we split up these elves and go our separate ways? Xion thought about it for a moment before nodding, and said, That's a good idea. You guys go and gather everyone here. You guys go in and keep an eye on those elves. Don't let anything happen to them. Everyone dispersed. Half of them entered the cave, while the other half spread out into the forest to gather more people. Xion took a glance at the cave before picking up his axe and preparing to leave. Chapter 907. Xion's expression changed drastically, and he stopped in his tracks. His whole body began to tremble as if he had heard the voice of a demon king. Sweat poured down his forehead, but he didn't dare to turn around. Mag walked out of the fog with his blood-stained longsword. He narrowed his eyes as he looked at the tall orc, who didn't dare to move at all at the entrance of the cave. This was a 7th-tier orc, and his power was 1 tier higher than his. However, he seemed to be frightened by him and stood still. This scene made him feel a little amused. Are you going to slit your own throat? Or do you want me to do it? Meg walked slowly toward Xion, and his feet made a rustling sound as he stepped on the soft leaves. More and more cold sweat poured down Xion's forehead. The footsteps behind him were getting closer and closer, and every step seemed to be stepping on his heart. The hidden sentries and spies in the forest didn't give any warning, but that was normal. It would be strange if they had the chance to give a warning in front of Alex. He didn't want to die, but he couldn't remember any of his seniors who had successfully escaped from Alex and Irina. Even the Carlo mercenary squad, which had 3 10th-tier powerhouses, was annihilated overnight. Not even a single ordinary mercenary escaped. Resist? Xion felt his trembling hands, almost unable to hold the heavy axe in his hands. He was only a 7th-tier warrior, and he wanted to resist Alex? He was crazy. Drops of sweat slid down his cheeks, and his mind was completely blank. He began to regret suggesting that the captain lead the mercenary squad to ambush the other mercenary squads near Chaos City. That was why they met Alex, the god of death. Looks like I still have to do it, Meg said calmly, standing 3 meters away. I'll kill you. Xion's eyes turned blood red instantly. His already tall and muscular body grew again, and he became like the Hulk. He stomped his feet on the ground, creating a huge pit. His body spun, and the big axe in his hand swept toward Meg at the same time. The blade of the axe was wrapped in a blood-red light, and it chopped down at Meg from above. The space rippled, and there were signs of it being cut open. Meg's gaze was very serious. This was the strongest opponent he had faced so far with his true strength. However, he did not panic because he was also at the pinnacle of the 6th rank. He was only 1 step away from the 7th rank. Moreover, his opponent's seemingly unstoppable axe was full of flaws in his eyes. Beastmen were known for their great strength, and were a race that could engage in close combat with forest trolls. However, it was also because of this that their combat techniques were extremely crude and straightforward. Meg bent his legs slightly, and with a soft sound, the leaves on the ground collapsed into a small pit. Meg's figure instantly rose up, and the tip of his foot lightly stepped on the side of the axe. Taking advantage of the momentum, he raised his long sword and slit Xion's throat, and then split half of his face into 2 from his chin. Clang! The giant axe fell to the ground, and Jean slowly fell to the ground with his eyes wide open. He looked at the masked man with a black cloak, his eyes filled with disbelief. This sword was very fast, but not as strong as he had imagined. This was not the strength that a 10th rank should have, And it was even more impossible for Alex to swing a sword. This was because Alex would not have needed to dodge his attack. Then who was this person? Gene's heart was filled with doubts and unwillingness. His eyes were wide open, and his head was tilted to the side. He was already dead. Combat experience is indeed a good thing, especially when dealing with these fellows who rely on brute force. Meg looked at Gene's corpse and thought silently to himself. The effect of Alex's countless combat experiences began to become more and more obvious as he faced more and more powerful opponents. Just like this time when he was fighting above his rank, Meg had effortlessly killed a 7th-rank beastman with precise judgment and powerful combat techniques. However, Meg was not too complacent. They were both 7th-rank beastmen, and if he had faced a similarly experienced knight, it would have been much more difficult for him to win. If he had faced a 7th-rank magic caster, he would have to consider whether he could get close to him before he was killed by magic. Father, you're so powerful. You kill these baddies as easily as swatting flies. Amy flapped her little wings and followed up, looking at Meg with admiration. Amy, it's up to you now. Meg turned to look at Amy and walked into the cave with his long sword. The commotion at the entrance of the cave had already spread into the cave. The orcs and demons that Gene had sent to watch over the elves had panicked looks on their faces. Their captain and vice-captain had just been killed. Could it be that the people of the Grey Temple had come to find them so quickly? Could it be that the Grey Temple has come to save us? The eyes of the elves, who were originally in despair, lit up, and they looked out through the narrow gap of the stone door. The demons who usually acted like tyrants were all panic-stricken at this moment, giving them hope. The sound outside the cave suddenly disappeared, and silence ensued. This made the demons even more terrified. A dozen demons and orcs stood in the passageway, holding weapons in their hands, and at a loss for what to do. Hurry up and capture them. Even if the people of the Grey Temple come, we still have hostages in our hands. Perhaps we can still exchange them for our lives. A demon who appeared to be the leader of the group yelled. The demons and orcs all came to their senses and hurriedly opened the prison doors. They dragged the bound elves out of the cave and pressed their daggers and long swords against their necks as they looked in the direction of the cave entrance anxiously. The elves were all tied up, and their mouths were stuffed with rags. They couldn't make a single sound, but their eyes were also fixed in the direction of the passageway. Even if they were going to die, they would at least be able to die in peace after witnessing these guys being killed. The sound of footsteps sounded from the entrance of the cave, following which a man in black robes and a black and white mask appeared at the entrance of the passageway. He was holding a long sword in his hand. Only one person? All of the demons and orcs faltered upon hearing the sound of footsteps. That sword! That sword! All of a sudden, a demon's gaze fell on the sword that the man was holding, and his face instantly paled as he said in a trembling voice, "It's him, Alex the Killing God. Alex the Killing God." All of the demons and orcs' expressions changed drastically upon hearing that. They looked at the man slowly making his way out of the passageway, and their bodies began to tremble involuntarily. Some of them even dropped their weapons. Alex. All of the elves' expressions also changed upon hearing that, and they all stared at the black-robed man with incredulity in their eyes. His face was concealed by a black and white mask, but the extremely renowned sword on the Norland continent was a clear indication of his identity. I declare that all of you deserve to die. Chapter 908. WXX by Chapter 909. After confirming that there was no one nearby, the purple-striped griffin swooped down and landed on the edge of the cliff again. Meg, who had already changed out of his black robe, jumped off the griffin's back with Amy in his arms. He patted Ozzy's head with a smile and said, "Let's go back, Ozzy." "How?" Ozzy shook its head and looked at Meg reluctantly, as if it was acting coquettishly. "Let's go back, Ozzy," Amy said as she patted Ozzy's head. Ozzy flew up into the sky with a whoosh and circled around Meg and the others twice before rising up and disappearing into the horizon. We should go back too. Meg retracted his gaze and carried Amy onto the horse's back. He comforted the horse that was frightened by the griffin and rode back to Chaos City. Amy turned to look at Meg as if she had discovered a new continent. Her little face was full of admiration, and she said, "Father, you're so awesome. Apart from cooking, you're also very good at beating up bad guys." Actually, Father has another identity, but I have too many enemies, so I can't let others know yet. Today's matter is a secret between Amy and I. You can't tell anyone else? Okay. Meg said to Amy with a smile. A secret between Father and me? Then Amy has a secret too. Amy's eyes lit up, and she nodded as she said, "I'll definitely keep this a secret." Good girl. Meg patted her head with a smile. Ding! The restaurant's upgrade is complete. The expansion of the restaurant has been completed. According to the host's request, the accommodation area on the second floor has also been upgraded. The host's elephant food bar quota for this month has been used up. Please pay it back before the 10th of next month. The system's voice sounded in Meg's mind. What will happen if I don't pay it back? Meg asked curiously. If you don't pay it back on time, your credit score will be lowered. At the same time, your elephant food bar quota will be lowered. At the same time, it will affect your credit, the system said seriously. Of course, this system is considerate enough to introduce an installment system. Can't pay it back? That's fine. The loan will be repaid in 12 monthly installments with low interest. It will help you repay the loan easily. The host then said briskly. Meg pursed his lips. You're not plagiarizing her flowers, are you? We're all in the financial industry. How can you say that you're copying? It's just a reference. The system emphasized seriously. Meg rolled his eyes. He couldn't be bothered with the system that was promoting all sorts of investments. Who the hell knew what those so-called investments he was making were? It was a game between a banker and a player. No matter how he played, he wouldn't be the one making money. After riding into Chaos City, Meg brought Amy to the Mercenary Guild. They didn't see anyone from the Rose Mercenary Squad, so they could only entrust an uncle in charge of the stables to return the horses to the Rose Mercenary Squad the next day. A horse was a very important companion for a mercenary. Meg had a griffin and a bicycle, so he didn't need a horse to travel. Therefore, he gave up on the idea of buying a good horse. Raising a good horse was more expensive than raising a good car. As a stay-at-home dad who lived within his means, he was already past that age. Besides, was there a better mount in the world than the purple-striped griffin? When Meg and the others came out of the Mercenary Guild, a group of mercenaries was talking loudly at the door. Did you hear? Another mercenary group was attacked near the Giant Valley today. Does anyone know what happened? A fat mercenary asked curiously. A middle-aged man with a goatee coughed lightly and said, I heard about it. I even rushed over to watch the show this afternoon, but the scene had already been sealed off by the Grey Temple when I arrived. However, I heard the exact news that the culprits had failed this time. Failed? Those guys haven't failed in this period of time? The mercenaries looked at the goatee mercenary curiously. They didn't fail because they were lucky before. However, they weren't so lucky this time because they met Alex. When they were attacking, God Alex descended and killed all of them with a sword. Not a single one of them was left. The goatee mercenary raised his voice with a hint of contempt. Alex, the mercenaries were shocked when they heard that. Then, they came to a realization. If those guys really met Alex, they naturally wouldn't have survived. It's said that when Lord Alex descended, he held the heavenly lightning in one hand and waved his sword in the other. In a flash, he took the lives of those bastards. Just imagining that scene makes me excited. The goatee mercenary became more and more excited as he spoke. It was as if he was there at the scene. Meg, who happened to walk to the side, couldn't help but laugh. Holding the heavenly lightning in one hand? Did he think he was a lightning king? This brother really should be electrocuted to wake him up a little. The goatee mercenary turned to look at Meg and said with a serious face, Little brother, what are you laughing at? Lord Alex got rid of a big problem for us mercenaries. You have to learn to fear and respect the strong. It's because of them that we mercenaries can continue to do missions in the wilderness with peace of mind. Meg nodded with a strange expression and said, "Yes, I should respect him." "That's right." The goatee mercenary nodded with satisfaction, then turned around and continued to brag. Meg led Amy through the large square in front of the guild. Almost all the mercenaries were excitedly discussing Alex's attack. There were all kinds of fantasy and suspense versions. As someone who had experienced it himself, Meg felt that he should let them write about it. "Father, are you the person they're talking about?" After leaving the mercenary guild, Amy grabbed Meg's finger and looked up at Meg curiously. "Maybe." Meg shrugged. He didn't know the guy who held the heavenly lightning in his hand anyway. "You're amazing. They all worship you." Amy's eyes were bright, and her little face was full of pride. It was already evening when they returned to the restaurant. "Father, did someone change the appearance of our restaurant?" Amy stood at the entrance of the restaurant and exclaimed in surprise as she looked at Amy's, which had doubled in size. "Father got someone to change it. Because there are too many customers, the original size can't fit." Meg looked at the expanded store and also showed some surprise on his face. Chapter 9:10. Meg was very satisfied with the railings and green plants. If only the 32 tables were spread out, it would look like a street food stall, which would make him feel less confident when he wrote the price of the dishes. However, after the wooden railings were installed, they did not block the view and added a touch of bourgeois taste, which was worth the price. "Mr. Mack, who did you hire to build this shop?" I heard some clanking sounds and came over to see that it was done. I didn't even see a shadow. "Isn't this too efficient?" Meg held Amy's little hand and was about to enter when Mabai came out of the blacksmith shop and looked at Meg curiously. Meg stopped and looked at Mabai with a smile. "A renovation master that I met before. He was in a hurry, so he left right after he finished. He's a magician, the kind that doesn't do proper work, but his efficiency is not bad." "Host, this system is warning you. This system is super professional." The system's angry roar sounded in Meg's mind, but Meg ignored it. "So he's a magician. No wonder." Mabai nodded with an enlightened expression. He inspected the expanded restaurant again and turned to Mag with a smile as he said, "Boss Mag, your restaurant has doubled in size. Will it be easier for you to eat in the future? The number of customers may not be able to double in a short time, but it should be easier to line up." Meg nodded with a smile. Mabai was also troubled. Although he lived next door, he was busy forging every day. By the time he finished his work, the line was already very far away. He often couldn't eat. "That's good. Now I really miss the days when there were only 2 or 3 customers in the shop. It's not like now, where I have to look at the line in advance to eat. If I'm not careful, I'll overtake." Mabai sighed. "Beautiful things are always worth looking forward to, isn't it?" Meg said with a smile. "That's right. In order to eat Mr. Mack's food, what's the point of queuing?" Mabai also nodded with a smile. He looked left and right, then came forward and whispered, "Mr. Mack, my alcohol addiction is starting to kick in. Can you give me a glass of beer?" "Just 1 glass is enough. I don't want anything else." "The Mabai boss hasn't eaten yet, right?" Meg asked. "Ah, yes, I just finished work and haven't eaten yet." Mabai was stunned for a moment before nodding. "It just so happens that we haven't eaten yet. Why don't you come in for dinner and have a drink together? I still have to thank the Mabai boss for selling the shop to me. You're still the first customer this time." Meg opened the door of the restaurant and invited Mabai with a smile. "All right, I won't stand on ceremony then." Mabai looked at Meg and laughed heartily. Meow, meow. As soon as the door opened, Ugly Duckling rushed out and jumped into Amy's arms. It meowed coquettishly, its big eyes full of grievance. "All right, I got it. I'll take you there next time, but from today onward, your appetite has to be halved. Otherwise, I feel like you're going to become a fat orange that can't fly," Amy said with a serious expression as she carried Ugly Duckling in her arms. Meow. Ugly Duckling looked at Amy pitifully. "There's no use begging me. I've already made up my mind." Amy turned her head away. She had no intention of changing her mind. She looked around the restaurant curiously. From time to time, she would play with the hydroponic plants that were planted in transparent glass bottles and hung on the wooden railings with hemp ropes. It was simple, yet elegant. Meg went upstairs to change into his chef's uniform. He put on an apron as he walked to the kitchen. The door was pushed open, and a long professional kitchen appeared before Meg's eyes. After the expansion of the restaurant, the kitchen had also more than doubled in size. The single-person kitchen was a little cramped after all kinds of kitchenware. A large refrigerator and a large water tank were stuffed in. In particular, it felt like he was surrounded by kitchenware when he had to cook several wok, skewers, and braised chicken at the same time. However, there were sharp and shiny knives hanging from the knife rack on the wall. The grill was placed in the corner, and the 4 wok pots were arranged in a row. All kinds of kitchenware were arranged according to Meg's habits, and he felt very comfortable. In addition to the horizontal expansion, the system had also increased the width of the kitchen by about half a meter. This way, the kitchen wouldn't be crowded even if there were 4 chefs cooking at the same time. Furthermore, there was more space for more kitchenware. Of course, the thing that attracted Meg's attention the most was the grill made of yellow mud beside the grill. It was the same model as the one he used to practice making roast duck in the test field for the God of Cookery. This customization is really smart. Meg walked up to the grill and looked at it for a while and nodded with satisfaction. There was probably no designer in this world who could understand what he wanted like the system, and it often exceeded his expectations. A large plate of roast beef kebabs, a large portion of spicy grilled fish, and a large glass of beer. Meg and Mabai drank to their heart's content and chatted for a long time. Mabai was the restaurant's first customer and neighbor. He was also Meg's first friend in this world. Meg had heard the dwarf blacksmith, who was determined to kill the giant dragon, talk about his past intermittently, but this was the first time he had heard him tell his complete story. Mabai's father was also an outstanding dwarven blacksmith, and the weapons he forged were very popular. Mabai learned from his father from a young age, and he also became a blacksmith. He married and had children and lived a stable life. One day, a giant dragon attacked their tribe and killed many innocent dwarves, including his father. 3 years later, he left the tribe and embarked on a journey to find that giant dragon. He couldn't stand the fact that his father and tribesmen had been killed for no reason, and he wanted revenge. Otherwise, he would never be able to rest in peace. He left for over 100 years, but still didn't find that giant dragon, nor did he return to his hometown. The war among species ended, and the Norland continent welcomed 100 years of peace, but he was still on the road to revenge. Mabai raised his head and downed the entire glass of beer in one gulp. His big brandy nose was red, and he said with a determined look in his eyes, "That damned red dragon. I'm going to kill it with my own hands." Meg refilled his glass and looked at him in silence. He didn't persuade him to go home, nor did he persuade him to let go of his hatred. Mabai's choice might not be the best, but he had never experienced it, so he had no right to judge. If it were Meg, he would probably make the same choice. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Mac. When I kill that red dragon, I'll buy you a drink." Mabai was a little drunk, and he waved at the door frame before staggering toward the blacksmith shop. Chapter 911. The news that Alex had saved a mercenary squad and killed all of the perpetrators was still spreading like wildfire among the mercenaries when another piece of even more exciting news began to spread. All of the elves who had been captured had been rescued. Aside from a few who had committed suicide, everyone else was still alive and had been brought back to Chaos City from the hideout of the murderers. However, it wasn't the Grey Temple that had done all of this. Instead, it was Alex. One man, one sword, broke into the hideout alone and killed all of the murderers. That night, the name Alex became the most talked about name in Chaos City. Some of the stories about him in the past were also dug up and became the hottest topic of conversation. Everyone listened with great interest and couldn't help but cheer for him. All of a sudden, everyone discovered that the world seemed to have become a lot more boring in the 3 years without Alex. Now that he was back in less than a month's time, there were many topics that everyone liked to talk about in their leisure time. In the Battle of Rodu, 6 10th-tier powerhouses and the spatial demon Patriarch perished. Immediately afterward, he appeared in the Wind Forest, severely wounded the Elven Great Elder, and protected Irina. He then went to Chaos City and announced that he would protect all of the Wandering Elves. Then, on this day, he descended from the heavens again and killed all of the murderers. Even though he was a human, he was no longer just a human hero. Meg was currently holding down Ugly Duckling, which was struggling to jump out of the bathtub with Amy. He didn't care what other people thought of him. In this world, nothing was more important than Amy, who had a bit of white foam on her nose. Ugly Duckling, if you don't take a good bath, then don't get on my bed from now on. I don't want a stinky guy sleeping next to me, Amy said to Ugly Duckling, who was trying to climb out of the tub with a serious expression. Ugly Duckling immediately stopped in its tracks. It looked at Amy for a while, and after ascertaining that she was serious, it withdrew its paw and meowed in a feeble voice. Meow. That's more like it. Amy nodded with satisfaction. She applied some shower gel on its body, and after rubbing it for a while, she turned to Ugly Duckling with a smile and said, Ugly Duckling, why don't you learn to swim? That way, you'll be able to save me if we fall into the water together in the future. Meow. Ugly Duckling's eyes immediately widened, as if it had heard something incredible. You're going to be very, very fat in the future. If you fall into the water, I won't be able to save you. But if I fall into the water, I won't be able to fall into the water, because I can fly. Amy with a smug look on her face. Meow. Ugly Duckling shook its little head as it slowly retreated with a fearful expression. You, of course. Of course, of you, of course. That's more like it. Swim for me. Meg then watched as a little orange cat began to swim in the bathtub. However, due to its poor technique and lack of experience, it choked on a few mouthfuls of water. However, after learning the dog paddle style, it was able to swim quite well. After blow-drying Ugly Duckling, Meg coaxed Amy to sleep and then went to the balcony by himself. The early winter nights were already a little cold. Meg wrapped his clothes tightly around himself and looked up at the starry sky. Sometimes he would wonder if there was a sun among the countless stars. It had been almost 4 months since he had come to this world. In the beginning, he had been at a loss, but now he had opened his heart and accepted this world. This was undoubtedly a very special experience for him. Of course, if it weren't for Amy, he probably wouldn't have been able to persist for so long. Perhaps he wouldn't even have the determination to walk out of the test field for the god of cookery. After all, he was such a lazy person. This world wasn't that beautiful. The conflicts between the different races never stopped, and even he couldn't stay out of it. Meg stood silently on the balcony and looked up at the starry sky. He began to sort out the problems that he had to face next and the direction that he had to work toward. In 3 months, the peace treaty signed by the Norland continent 100 years ago would expire. Whether the different races chose to renew the treaty would determine whether this relatively peaceful situation could continue to be maintained. Everyone knew that the renewal of the treaty would definitely not go smoothly. After 100 years of recuperation, all the races would have their own ideas, and it would clearly not be easy to reach a consensus. Otherwise, all the races would have made an announcement after the birthday banquet of the Roth Empire, but they didn't. The possibility of an all-out war between species was very low. After all, even the powerful dragon tribe had been severely damaged in the war. However, there would definitely be a lot of local wars. It was very likely that the different races would redistribute their territories according to their power, and many innocent people would still die in the war. With Meg's current power, he naturally couldn't do anything in this matter. Even Alex couldn't do anything in the past. At most, he could make some statements in Alex's name and let those who made the decisions know the boundaries in their hearts. The restaurant was now on the right track. After the upgrade and expansion today, the turnover should increase significantly. However, he had just spent a huge amount of gold coins to buy 2 strength points from the system. He didn't know when he would be able to earn enough money for the next strength point, so it was also very unlikely that his power would increase drastically in a short period of time. The steam engine had already been handed over to the city lord's castle and the Buffett Financial Group. It was equivalent to him using his patent to buy a stake in the motorcycle industry and 20% of the steam engine's other uses. The possibility of mass production and huge profits in a short period of time was also very low. This was especially so for the construction of the railway. This was a bottomless pit. Before a stable transportation channel was formed, who knew how much money he would have to pour into it before he could reap the profits? Compared to the railway, Meg was more optimistic about the steam engine's other uses in the short term. Textiles, machinery, smelting. In all aspects of the industry, the steam engine's application space was very wide. It was a vast blue sea. Efficiency was its strongest competitiveness. Once it entered the mass production stage, it would bring him and Buffett banks incomparably huge profits. Meg was very clear about this from the beginning. If he firmly held the steam engine in his hands and operated it properly, it would not be impossible for him to become the new richest man on the Northern continent. You're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.